Chapter 653. I'm back. Hearing these calm words and looking at the wounded Zwafan, Luo Sha's eyes flashed. She pursed her lips and finally said, "It's good that you're back." It was an ordinary conversation, but it was unusually warm and harmonious. Zwafan nodded and looked guilty. "I'm sorry that I can't protect you anymore," he shook his head and interrupted. "It's okay." Luo Sha bit her lips. "I know it's all because of me. Actually, I hoped that you would leave just now." Pause for a while, he waved his hand to stop Zwafan and continued, "Let me finish. I don't mean anything else, but it's better to have one dead than two dead. Also, I just appointed Josiah as the new leader of the Grey Coat Army. I hope that you can protect her, just like how you protected me for the past 10 years. Zwafan's eyelids drooped as he shook his head. He took a deep breath, turned around, and threw out his sword. His hands left afterimages as he formed a strange seal in front of his chest and pointed out. "Stop." A few meters in the air, the long sword stopped. The tip of the sword pointed towards the east, standing in the void. "Stop." With another shout, Zwafan's surroundings suddenly surged with a cylindrical battle glow that poured into the slightly trembling sword body above him. At this moment, Zwafan, who was below, and the sword above were connected by this pure cylindrical golden combat aura, like an arch bridge. Suddenly, the ground around Zwafan trembled as if it couldn't bear the weight anymore. Cracks like a spider web appeared on the ground. Luo Sha was fine as she was sitting near the wall. Other than the wooden carvings on the table falling down, she only needed to lean against the wall. On the other hand, Bosco got up in a hurry, but because he couldn't stand properly, he crashed into the wall behind him. His old face turned red. However, this was just a little embarrassing. Bosco was more worried about the cracked ground. Every time a new crack appeared, his face would turn pale. He was afraid that a sudden explosion would drown this place. At this moment, Zwafan shouted again, "Go!" It was just a simple word, but when it came out from the dazzling light, one could already hear that it was a little hoarse and a little forced. Of course, no one would pay attention to this at the moment. As the word "out" was uttered, ripples visible to the naked eye suddenly appeared in the space around the golden longsword. It was as if it wasn't the air, but the water surface. The ripples grew wider and wider, spreading out like water. He didn't know if it was an illusion caused by the spatial folds, or if the longsword was already saturated. In the blink of an eye, a dazzling golden halo appeared around the sword. It looked like a new rising sun peeking out from the east in the early morning. One sword. Sunday out. Looking at the miraculous scene in front of him, Hai Ta's body shook violently. He spat out these words with great difficulty. Then, he took a deep breath and quickly rose into the sky before the tidal ripples came. Go! Although he didn't think that Zwafan's attack was aimed at them, he had no choice but to retreat in the face of such a powerful attack. At the same time, after retracting his gaze, Hai Ta's expression was extremely complicated. To sum it up, it could be said that he was deeply moved and sorrowful. He was deeply moved that this brilliant junior brother didn't disappoint his master. In addition to the previous sword comes from the east, he had actually successfully comprehended the sword god's two move. As for sorrowful, Hai Ta was naturally clear that such a frightening sword move wasn't something that could be casually used. Moreover, with Zwafan's current physical condition, there was no doubt that this junior brother of his, who he hadn't seen for many years, had already lost his will to die. On the other side, there was no need for Hai Ta's reminder. The trembling Wensilin subconsciously rose into the sky and retreated. His sharp eyebrows and starry eyes were filled with confusion. He didn't think as much as Hai Ta. He only knew that if Zwafan hadn't used sword comes from the east and had used this sword comes from the sun, he would have most likely died. How is this possible? Is there really someone in this world who is more talented than me in martial arts? The complicated feelings of the few people didn't change. In fact, the rising sun around the sword had already taken shape and was floating in the sky, shining with boundless radiance. This was the moment when the arrow was knocked on the bow and had to be released. Go! With a sigh of relief, the motionless ball of sword radiance suddenly flashed and disappeared from its original position. As expected, it did not fly towards Sea Tower or Winston in the sky. Instead, it drew a beautiful arc and left a golden afterimage behind. It landed directly at the western gate of the City of Dawn. There, the Knights of the Temple of Light and the soldiers of the Brand rushed in like a tide. Some people saw the golden light ball, but they only raised their heads and looked at it blankly. They didn't have any intention of dodging it. Of course, there wasn't much difference between dodging it and not dodging it. Boom! There were explosions near and far. A strong gust of wind blew and a golden wave rushed into the sky. Because she was inside the barren walls, Rosa couldn't feel anything. She also didn't know how many souls had been affected by this attack. She only looked at the top of the wall and saw that under the curtain of rain in the west, the blurry and majestic wall was like a pile of flour that collapsed instantly. It was in this dusky twilight that a golden stream of light flew into the sky along with the surging waves. It was heading towards where Haita and the others were. Cough, cough. I'm sorry, Brother Haita. I can't go back with you. This sword was given to me by my master. Now, please return it for me. As soon as he finished speaking, the golden light around Zwafan collapsed. The golden light was blown away by the wind, revealing a slightly hunched figure. Suddenly, his body swayed and staggered a few steps. He held onto a wooden chair beside him to prevent himself from falling. Ha ha! Zwafan chuckled and wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth. He looked at Rosa, who was in a daze, and said, "Now that I've lost half of my strength, it's impossible for me to leave this place." It was not that he didn't want to leave, but that he didn't have the ability to leave. You! Rosa's lips moved, but because her teeth were tightly clenched, she couldn't say a complete sentence in the end. Zwafan pressed his violently heaving chest and walked over. I'm sorry. This is the first time I've rejected your request, and it will also be the last time. He paused as if he wanted to say something, but because he wasn't good with words, he only said in the end, "Anyway, just like I said before. My sword will always protect you, and only you." Are you an idiot? Luo Sha blinked his eyes and lowered his head, his vision blurred. Vaguely, the scene in front of her changed instantly. It was a small hill in the south of the empire. It was spring, and the birds were singing and the flowers were fragrant. The grass was green. At that time, she was a young girl from a small noble family, and he was the son of a servant. She was carefree and always took him, a quiet little follower who had just learned swordsmanship, everywhere. That time, because of her carelessness, the two of them rolled down from the hill. She was fine, but his nose was bruised and his eyes were swollen. There were a few bloody scratches on his body. Of course, it was all because he wanted to protect her. When he was treating the wounds, she was scared to tears by the blood on her hands. However, he patted his chest and said that as a man, these wounds were nothing. He winked at her to make her laugh and waved the wooden sword in his hand. He solemnly promised, "Don't worry, I will use this sword in my hand to protect you forever." She wasn't amused by his clumsy facial expression. Instead, she laughed because of his funny little adult look when he promised, "Haha, idiot. You are crying?" Zwafan stood aside hesitantly. He didn't know what to do. No, it's just the rain." Wiping her eyes, Rosa raised her head in the heavy rain. Her eyes were red, but there was a careless smile on her face. "Haha, you came at the right time. The wooden carvings you mentioned before. Where are the wooden carvings?" On the wooden table, the rows of wooden carvings had been shaken to the ground by the strong tremor just now. Rosa quickly bent down to pick them up and said, "You said there was a hidden meaning in them. You weren't lying to me, right? Why didn't I see it?" "There is indeed something." Zwafan scratched his head and looked down. He picked up 4 wooden carvings and placed them on the table. They are in here. Only 4? Then why did you give me so many? Oh, you are getting more and more cunning. You want to distract me. Ahem, that. Bosco coughed and slid down from the wall. Looking at Rosa and Zwafan, he couldn't help but feel bitter. Sorry, I just wanted to ask. Can I go now? Zwafan frowned and looked at Rosa. Kill or not? No. Oh. Zwafan nodded and waved his hand without asking for a reason. Boom. Bosco, who still wanted to say something, crashed through the wall behind him like a cannonball and rolled out. There was a sudden uproar outside. Hey, what is that? Don't attack, it's Master. Master finally came out. Master, should we fight our way in now? Slap. There was a clear sound of a slap. The outside of the wall suddenly became quiet, and then a roar sounded. Fight your mother, hurry up and help me run. The 2 people in the room didn't care about this little episode. Rosa held her chin and looked at the 4 wooden carvings on the table. One of them was a carving of herself, and the others were images of a bull, a bear, and a snake. She frowned and thought for a while. Finally, she looked back and shook her head. I can't tell, these carvings are not related at all. So difficult? Zwafan rubbed his forehead and looked a little uncertain. He then pointed at the wooden carvings and gave a hint. Say their names. Names? Rosa was confused. I know, this is me, this is a rhinoceros, this is a raccoon, this is a snake. This is a mud snake, a low-level magic beast, slightly poisonous. Rosa spread out her hands. So? Zwafan paused and unconsciously avoided Rosa's eyes. He looked a little hesitant and finally said with difficulty, Take the first word of their names. Are you kidding me? How can I guess? Let me think. Rosa. Rhino. You don't need to add your name. I know. So troublesome, and so childish. Rosa curled her lips in disdain, but in fact, she had already started to organize it in her mind. Rhino. Mud. What are these? His expression suddenly froze. Rhinoceros mud likes. Are you an idiot? How could you have guessed it? I used to know that you were a blockhead, but now it seems that you are full of stones. But. She said a lot of things very quickly, then suddenly paused, looked up slightly, closed her eyes and murmured in a low voice, Just like? That would be a big loss for me. I love you. After a while, she said angrily, why are you still, Don't you know that when a woman poses like this, she is reminding you to do something? I don't want to talk to you. Woo. Looking up, there was still no sign of the pouring rain, as if it was determined to wash away the evil in this world. At this time, the battle in the city was actually coming to an end. The invaders swept through every street, every alley, and every house. Their eyes were red with bloodlust as they searched for a target to kill. Occasionally, they would meet a young man who was walking absent-mindedly. They subconsciously wanted to kill him, but after losing a few brothers, they would wake up and quickly retreat. In the east of the city, a large number of civilians rushed out of the city gate in panic, running towards the vast wilderness. That was their hope of survival. In the sky above the city, 2 people stood in the void. One of them was absent-minded and looked lost. The other stroked the golden sword in his hand and sighed. In the periphery, more than 10 miles south of the city, a tired-looking girl was riding on a horse, waving her whip and rushing towards the city. But at this time, in the center of the city, boom! Chapter 654. A few days later, in the northern wilderness, the consecutive days of wind and fish seemed to have consumed a lot of God's energy. In the morning, everything finally stopped, and the omnipresent bone-chilling wind also felt a little weaker. Looking at the sky, it was as if it had been cleaned. It was blue like a huge jade crystal. When he lowered his head slightly, a vast grassland came into view. He could see everything at a glance. If one squinted and looked carefully, at the end of their line of sight, which was also the end of the grassland, they would find a black line that directly cut off the grassland. That was a towering city wall that stretched for tens of kilometers from east to west. It was really imposing. It's magnificent, isn't it? Tang En tilted his head slightly and looked at Andre, who was also looking at the city wall in the distance. He nodded. It's magnificent. It's estimated to be tens of kilometers long. I haven't seen a city wall longer than this in the Bran. To be precise, it's 79 kilometers. Andre looked at the city wall in the distance, and there was an unconcealable pride on his face. In terms of numbers, the number of tribal cities is indeed far less than the Bran. But the scale of the Grand Wilderness Imperial City in front of us is also incomparable to all the cities in the Bran. Have you seen many Bran cities? Not really. Andre simply shook his head and then smiled. But I know the length of the city wall in the Bran. It's 69 kilometers long. Haha, our ancestors built the Grand Wilderness Imperial City according to this scale, so it was increased by 10 kilometers. Haha, a little interesting. Tang En couldn't help but laugh and shake his head. Although it might sound dismissive, one could see the whole picture from a single spot. From this aspect, one could see the extent of the enmity between the Northern Wilderness and the Bulan Empire. Even in terms of the scale of the city construction, the Northern Wilderness was trying to suppress the Bulan Empire. After chatting for a while, Tang En still focused most of his attention on the city wall in front of him. He couldn't help but sigh in his heart. Damn! How could he run all the way to the Northern Wilderness Imperial City? What the hell was going on? That's right, the city in front of Tang En was the royal center of the Northern Wilderness tribes. Grand Desolate City. Of course, it wasn't wrong to call it the Great Wilderness Imperial City or the Northern Wilderness Imperial City. The only difference was that the former was how the people of the Northern Wilderness addressed it, while the latter was how the people of the Bran addressed it. That day, Tang En and Lan Sha did not walk out of the grassland on foot. Along the way, they encountered a large group of wilderness wolf riders. After asking around, they found out that the rebellion in the Battle Lion tribe had already been quelled. This large group of wilderness wolf riders had been sent by the Empress as reinforcements. The rest of the journey was simple. With the giant wolves as their mounts, they quickly returned to the barbarian bear tribe. Soon after, he found out that they had won the battle at the Steep Peak and Steep Cliff. Over 10,000 rebel soldiers had either died or surrendered. The rebel commander, Anna, was also impaled by a spear in the midst of the chaos. The latter made Lan Sha shake his head and sigh. Teacher and Shuai's lineage had been cut off just like that. After that, Lan Sha picked up Andre, Shini, and the other original members of the caravan. After promising rewards to the tribes that participated in the encirclement, he led the wilderness wolf riders and traveled for a few days. Finally, they arrived here in the morning. Sigh. With a long sigh and a helpless shake of his head, Tang En cursed in his heart. F***ck, we've traveled so far. How am I supposed to go back in the future? Mr. Arthur. Mr. Arthur, Oh, sorry, I was a bit distracted. With an apologetic smile, Tang En came back to his senses. What did you say? Andre shook his head unconcernedly. Nothing. I was just talking about the situation in the royal city. Maybe Mr. Arthur will encounter something in the future. The people of the Northern Wilderness don't have a good attitude towards the Bran people. Although there are some Bran people who live here, they mostly do things behind the scenes like giving advice. They also keep a low profile. But even so, they are often ostracized and suppressed by others, and even find an excuse to beat them up. Even if they are really wronged, it is actually hard to say. Even if someone helps to stand up for them, in the end, it is often left unsettled. Understood. Seeing that Andre was trying to organize his words, Tang En nodded. Pushing aside outsiders is normal. It's the same everywhere. I can understand. Anyway, it's better to live with your tail between your legs. Is that what you mean? The words were a bit harsh, but they were indeed harsh. That was the truth. From Tang En's point of view, It wasn't easy for Andrei to say this. Of course, there was a reason for this. After Lan Sha casually said that it was Tang En who saved her, Andrei and others' attitude towards him changed greatly. They were even respectful. Because in a sense, Tang En was also the savior of these guards. After all, if something happened to Mistress Lan Sha, they wouldn't be able to survive either. Tang En thought that he understood Andrei's intention. It was nothing more than a precaution, so he naturally agreed. He didn't come here to cause trouble this time. He came to get the antidote and then slip away. Naturally, he had to keep a low profile. However, not really. Andrei scratched his head when he heard this. He seemed to be organizing his words again, but this was obviously not his strength. In the end, he simply spread his hands and said, "Forget it, I'll just say it directly. Well, Mr. Arthur saved His Highness Lan Sha, and now you have the intention to join us, so we will be on the same side in the future. In this way, of course, we can no longer let you be treated rudely. Don't worry about your special identity, we will spread the news after entering the city, so as not to cause any unnecessary trouble." After a pause, he rubbed his palms. "Also, if someone is blind enough to provoke Mr. Arthur, please inform us in time. We will immediately send someone to deal with it and guarantee that you won't be at a disadvantage." "Well, Mr. Arthur, do you understand what I'm saying?" I understand." After a pause, Tang En touched his nose and couldn't help but smile bitterly. F***ck, they are treating me like a terrorist. What's the point of keeping a low profile? Phew. That's good. Compared to Twain's gloominess, Andrei heaved a long sigh of relief, looking as if a heavy burden had been lifted off his shoulders. He was really scared. How could he be calm when facing a guy who could even kill a void stage cultivator? And in the previous contact, especially when the other party was like a crazy demon, Andrei dared to pat his chest and firmly believed that this was definitely a master who only cared about killing. If any idiot in the city provoked him, the result would be unimaginable. Thinking like this, Andrei secretly decided in his heart, "No, when I go back, I must give him some guards. In short, I can't give him a chance to attack." The depressed Tang En of course didn't know what Andrei was thinking, otherwise, he would have argued with him. F***ck, this young master looks harmless to humans and animals, how did he become a murderous demon to you? After solving the future hidden dangers, Andrei was obviously relaxed and asked, "Mr. Arthur, His Highness Lan Sha has been absent-minded recently, do you know the reason?" Tang En shook his head when he heard this. "I don't know. Maybe he was scared by what happened before. No matter what, he committed suicide by jumping off a cliff. It's inevitable that there will be some sequelae." Tang En of course could see that Lan Sha was in a trance recently, but he really didn't know the reason. He only knew that after they saw Green Wolf tearing the goshawk apart on the grassland, Lan Sha had been like this and was obviously unwilling to get close to him. Occasionally when he saw her, she would mutter to herself, "How could this be? Why didn't Green Wolf die?" And so on, which was very inexplicable. Then Andrei also guessed some reasons, but in the end, he had no choice but to give up this guess that obviously did not have an answer. While chatting, the team quickly approached the towering city wall, and the Imperial City was right in front of them. However, at this time, Andrei's body suddenly trembled, and he looked at the city gate in disbelief. There, countless figures were running up and down the city wall, and their purpose was obviously to build a new city gate and repair the bumpy and half-paralyzed ancient city wall. What's going on? Could it be that the traitors of the Battle Lion tribe are so bold that they dare to destroy the Imperial City? No. The Wilderness Wolf cavalry at the side heard this and couldn't help but shake his head and sigh as he looked at the large-scale construction at the city gate. This was done by Z's men. Chapter 655. Perhaps it was due to the belief of royalty, or perhaps it was due to the rarity of things. The imperial city of the great wilderness held a very high position in the hearts of all the people in the northern wilderness. Therefore, even the traders from before would not think of destroying this symbol of the northern wilderness that was condensed from the sweat and blood of countless ancestors unless it was absolutely necessary. As a result, the appearance of this completely blasted open and completely undefended city gate, as well as the half-collapsed city wall that was full of holes and holes, was naturally the work of Z. André and the others were naturally furious when they saw this scene and couldn't help but mutter a few curses. But if one looked closely, one would find that there was actually a hint of admiration mixed in. The northern wilderness had always revered the strong, and whether it was Z's great reputation in the past or his outstanding battle record of charging into the imperial city not long ago, he was qualified to make the people of the northern wilderness sigh in admiration while being enraged. Tangan didn't have such complicated thoughts. He just looked at the messy city wall in front of him and thought about Z's roar of "Come out and see me 3 times here." He couldn't help but feel a little sad about the fate of this hero, who he had known for a short time but had been a spiritual friend for a long time. After entering the city gate, with Lan Shah's noble status, there were naturally people there to welcome him. However, Lan Shah didn't care. He dismissed the Wilderness Wolf cavalry and directly led Tang En and the original caravan members into the imperial palace in the city. Therefore, before Tang En could leave any impression on the imperial city of the northern wilderness, he was stunned to find that he, a fake brand commoner, was about to enter the true center of power in the northern wilderness, the imperial palace of the northern wilderness. He couldn't help but sigh at how fickle fate was. The so-called imperial palace, or more accurately, the imperial castle, was actually a design similar to a city within a city. The defense here wasn't any weaker than the outer city walls. Take the city wall for example. Although it couldn't be compared to the outer city walls in terms of length and scale, it was obviously taller and more majestic. Moreover, elite soldiers and generals were piled up on top of the wall, and all kinds of large-scale defensive equipment were also very complete. It was not an exaggeration to say that they were armed to the teeth. It could be said that once a battle broke out, even if the Grand Desolation Imperial City was lost, the defenses here would be able to hold on for a long time. However, looking at the main gate of the broken castle, a large number of masons were also repairing it. Lan Shah's group, who had hurried over, couldn't help but stop in their tracks. F***CK. Z's invention was so powerful? I've picked up a treasure. Tang En looked at the obvious traces of the city gate being blasted open. Of course, he knew what kind of weapon had caused this. He could not help but feel delighted. He felt as if he had been hit by gold coins while walking on the street. After a short pause, everyone officially entered the castle. Although Tang En's appearance was obviously that of a Bran, with Lan Shah leading the way, naturally, there wouldn't be any guards who didn't know better. After entering the castle, Tang En's first impression was that it was huge. Not only was the space spacious, but all the buildings were also very imposing. Stone pillars that a few people couldn't carry were almost everywhere, and these were only the pillars of each building. However, the northern wilderness was the northern wilderness after all. Although they might not be lacking in financial resources, there were basically no useless gorgeous decorations in the castle. There were only sturdy rocks of various colors, among which the main color was black and gray, revealing a heavy sense of the vicissitudes of life. At the same time, it was also very quiet here. Other than the guards who patrolled from time to time, there were basically no miscellaneous people. The servants who occasionally passed by were mostly women. When they saw them, they bowed silently in the distance and then quietly retreated. It was a strong contrast to the hustle and bustle of the outer city. Here, there was no smell of the marketplace. There was only the majesty of royalty at the top of the pyramid like a mountain. Touching his nose, Tang En was slightly unaccustomed to the atmosphere here. This was normal. Every place had its own rules and aura. If one had never seen it before, one would be able to truly be at ease. Unless one's status and strength reached a certain level, everything was like floating clouds. Otherwise, it would undoubtedly be a fool's dream. Turning his head to look around, he saw that André and the others, who had been smiling calmly before, also had solemn expressions on their faces. Their eyelids were slightly lowered, and they had a serious look on their faces. Sheeny was a little better. She was obviously very familiar with this place. As for Lan Sha, although he looked very calm on the surface since entering the city until now, but Tang En, who was already familiar with her, could still see that she was a little absent-minded, as if she was full of worries and eager to verify. It was under this somewhat heavy atmosphere that everyone gradually went deeper into the castle. Then, at an arched door, a middle-aged beautiful woman in plain clothes came out with a light smile. She bowed and saluted. "Your Highness Lan Sha, seeing that you have returned safely, I am relieved." This middle-aged beautiful woman's identity seemed to be somewhat unusual. Lan Sha stepped forward and held her arm. "Aunt Celine, I have said many times that you don't need to salute. And where is Mother? Is everything all right here?" "Your Highness, don't worry. Previously, it was just a few clowns from the Battle Lion tribe who used this as an excuse to cause trouble. Now it has completely calmed down. However, some small things that happened because of this are rather trivial. The Empress is currently in the side hall discussing with the various princes. Hearing that you have returned, she sent me out first to bring you to the main hall to wait." After casually pacifying him, Lan Sha nodded. Then, this middle-aged beautiful woman called Celine waved her hand at André and the others, indicating that they should withdraw. Very obviously, this wide arched door carved with unknown totems was the boundary between the inside and outside of the castle. Now that they were here, André and the others couldn't enter with their status. Sheeny, on the other hand, after saluting Celine, passed through the arched door and entered inside. Tang En looked around and saw that Lan Sha did not have time to pay attention to him. He was about to leave with André and the others. Unexpectedly, Celine suddenly looked over and said with a chuckle, "Hee, you must be the guest from Bulan. I heard that you saved His Highness Lan Sha this time. And I am here to thank you on behalf of the Sirius royal family." After saying this, she solemnly bowed at the waist. Tang En could not help but be startled when he heard this. He then touched his nose and helplessly spread out his hands. "You are welcome. Actually, it was really just an accident. N, who told her to directly hit me after jumping off the cliff." Learning from his previous mistake, Tang En now took the time to enter the system once every few days. In this way, in addition to gaining a huge amount of blood and chi from killing Yama, when he replayed the previous battle, Tang En naturally saw the tragic scene of him being a human cushion for Lan Sha. Hee. Tang En's self-deprecating words caused Celine to cover her mouth and laugh lightly. Lan Sha at the side glared at him, then blushed slightly and turned his head away, seemingly embarrassed. No one knew that her blush was actually not because of this embarrassing incident, but more because she thought of the scene under the water. "I have to say, I really like your sense of humor, the Brands. And, I'm sorry, what is your name?" "Arthur." "All right, Mr. Arthur. Please come with me to the main hall, the Empress invites you." After being slightly startled, Tang En quickly came back to his senses and shrugged nonchalantly. Based on the clues he had, the matter that Z had asked him to do was most likely related to the Northern Wilderness Empress. Of course, Tang En did not mind doing it since it was just a passing message. However, after André patted him on the shoulder, he looked very envious. Obviously, in his opinion, Tang En would undoubtedly be rewarded this time. As for them, as Lan Sha's guards, they had diligently protected him for so long, but in the end they were almost sentenced to death. Indeed, comparisons were odious. Under the lead of Celine and Lan Sha, Tang En passed through the heavily guarded arch and went to the so-called main hall of the castle. The distance between them was still relatively far, but it was not boring along the way. Although Celine's identity was unknown, her way of dealing with people was top-notch. She could very well liven up the atmosphere without batting an eyelid. What was even more commendable was that she took care of everything. Not only did she not feel anything strange about Tang En's identity as the Bran, but she also made Tang En talk about the Bran, and then corroborated with the exaggerated rumors in the northern wilderness. With such a great disparity, it was also a rare interesting thing. The laughter was endless. After entering, Tang En knew why Andre and the others were not allowed to enter. It turned out that this place was not as deserted as the outside. Although it was not lively, they could always see some servants after walking a few steps. And these people were almost all women. Even the few patrols that Tang En saw were all made up of female warriors. Could it be that they had entered womanland? Tang En thought so. Of course, this was just a joke. Tang En himself could also think of the reason. This should be related to the Empress. In order to avoid arousing suspicion, the current situation was created. After walking for about 10 minutes, the three finally arrived at the main hall of the castle. Immediately, Tang En and Lan Sha stopped in their tracks. They blinked their eyes, and their faces were full of astonishment. A few lonely columns stood tall. The original majestic pure white color was gone, and there were only traces of black ash left behind by the fire. And this was already considered lucky, because there were more than 10 columns lying quietly on the ground, broken into several pieces. At a glance, the outer area of the main hall was in a mess, and it was a scene of devastation. Needless to say, this was definitely done by Zi. Seeing this, Tang En could not help but take a deep breath. He finally understood why the Northern Wilderness Empress had to go to the side hall to discuss matters instead of the main hall. Then, the corner of his mouth twitched a few times. Thinking about what he had seen after entering the city, he thought to himself, damn it. It seemed like all that was missing was the Zi was here. Celine was obviously used to this. She shook her head and sighed, let's go in. The inside is almost repaired. After a few more days, this place will be restored to its original state. After saying this, she led Tang En and Lan Sha to a small path that was cleared out by someone in the ruins. And just as they stepped into the hall, Tang En's long and narrow eyes could not help but squint. He stared blankly at the innermost part of the hall. There, on a chair that was burned out of shape but still looked luxurious, was a full set of light purple armor. There was a faint light shining, and the purple light flowed like water, looking mysterious and noble. This is Zi's armor? Chapter 656. This is Zi's armor? After Tang En subconsciously blurted out, Lan Sha's gaze suddenly froze. Only then did she carefully size up the somewhat rebellious light purple armor that was placed in that position. Celine, who came in and ordered someone to bring tea, looked at Tang En in surprise. She nodded and walked over. Yes, this is indeed Zi's armor. Lan Sha murmured, so the previous rumors were true. According to the rumors, Zi died after leading his troops to break through the city gate. However, his fearless subordinates carried his body into the main hall of the palace in the northern wilderness and burned themselves to death. Of course, this was just a rumor on the street. Although the attitude of the royal family in the northern wilderness was worth pondering, they did not deny or cover up after the fact. This made people suspicious. However, no matter what, they did not directly admit that this was the truth. Therefore, most people in the northern wilderness did not believe this rumor that made them lose face. Yes. Celine nodded and looked at the light purple armor with a complicated expression in her eyes. However, after a flash, she covered it up very well. She shook her head and said, in fact, if it wasn't for this rebellion, this set of armor would have been sent to the Bran by now. What? Lan Sha looked at her in surprise. Tang En also raised his eyebrows in surprise. Who was Zi? Based on his achievements in the past few decades, It was not an exaggeration to say that he was the barbarian's executioner. Moreover, this time he played a big game. He directly slapped the faces of all the barbarians in the northern wilderness. Even so, he could send the relic back? What kind of noble sentiment is this? Serene calmly explained, the Bran Empire has a proposal. If we send Z's body back, they will release Prince Tiu and the tribe's 3,000 captives. However, Z's body has been burned clean by the fire, so we can only use this armor in exchange. Mother agreed? No one objected? Of course there will be objections, but the Empress is inclined to agree. After all, it's just a set of armor. Naturally, it's not as important as a living person, not to mention that it involves His Highness Tiu. Lan Shah's eyelids drooped slightly as he bit his lip and muttered, "Is that really all?" "That's definitely not the case." Tang En curled his lips in disdain and thought to himself, "This doesn't conform to the universal law of old lovers are always better." Upon seeing this, Selene's lips moved slightly as if she wanted to say something. However, after glancing at Tang En, she pursed her lips and gave up in the end. It was also at this moment that the sound of light footsteps suddenly came from behind. Tang En was the first to notice it, but when he turned his head, he was stunned. It was a woman dressed in a black fur coat. Her beautiful and familiar face had an indifferent expression. There was no additional movement in her every move, but a faint natural power slowly spread out. "This is Lan Shah's elder sister?" Tang En only glanced at her once before he subconsciously looked at Lan Shah. The two of them were too similar, whether it was the delicate face or the faint but confident temperament. If Tang En didn't know that Lan Shah didn't know martial arts and wasn't wearing this outfit today, he really would have thought that Lan Shah had silently circled behind him. However, "Mother!" With a slightly surprised call, Lan Shah quickly walked to the front of the woman. With a smile on his face, he bowed and saluted. Good. It's good that you're back." The woman also narrowed her eyes and chuckled. However, it was clear that she was a person who was more rational than emotional. Although one could see that she was excited, she only grabbed Lan Shah's arm and spoke very simply. "No way." Tang En looked at the two extremely similar faces in front of him and couldn't help but rub his eyebrows in confusion. F***ck. Z, oh Z, I have to say, it's not wrong for you to fall into the hands of this woman. Actually, ever since he found out Z's purpose in coming to the northern wilderness, Tang En had always had a gossipy guess in his heart. That was, what kind of woman could make Z so obsessed that he would risk his life to come and see her? Moreover, when she looked at Z's devilish face that could make most women die from anger, wouldn't she feel a mountain of pressure? Now, everything had an explanation. Perhaps only this beautiful woman in front of him, who seemed to have been forgotten by time, and Z could be called a perfect couple, a perfect pair made in heaven. After sighing with emotion, Tang En once again sized up the beautiful sisters in front of him, Lan Shah and the Northern Wilderness Empress, and finally discovered the differences between the two. First of all, the Empress was slightly taller than Lan Shah. When she smiled, faint crow's feet could still be seen at the corners of her eyes. Moreover, after careful observation, the temperament of the two was actually a little different. Although they were both confident, indifferent, and full of nobility, the Empress was more imposing than the Empress. However, the Empress was more dignified than Lan Shah. Lan Shah also lacked the aura of looking down on the world unconsciously. On the other hand, Lan Shah looked more lively than the Empress, and seemed to be full of spirit. After exchanging some pleasantries, the Empress glanced at Tang En, and her eyes flashed imperceptibly. Then, with a calm expression, she said, "Lan Shah, you and Selene go out for a while. I and this person, Arthur, Mr. Arthur," Selene introduced in a timely manner. She nodded. "I have some matters to discuss with Mr. Arthur." Hearing this, Lan Shah looked at Tang En in surprise. At this time, the latter was looking at the Empress with a puzzled expression. Logically speaking, Tang En was also an outsider. So no matter what the situation was, it shouldn't be his turn to interact with the Empress first. However, since the Empress had already said so, Lan Sha could only follow Selene out of the main hall first. And it was unknown what had triggered him, but Lan Sha's expression was obviously somewhat thoughtful. Watching Lan Sha and Selene disappear outside the main hall, Tang En turned his head and met the Empress's somewhat cold gaze. For a moment, he was speechless. Tang En and Selene weren't the only ones in the spacious main hall. Behind the Empress, there were also a few obese women who were carrying something. But no one made the slightest movement. It even felt like even their breathing had become lighter. It was silent all around. After a while, Tang En took the lead to break the silence. After all, it wasn't a good idea to be in a deadlock like this. He took the initiative to avoid the somewhat hostile gaze and bowed politely. "Good morning, Your Majesty. And have you eaten?" Outside the main hall, after hesitating a few times, Lan Sha finally raised his head and looked at Selene firmly. "Aunt Selene, you've been with Mother since you were young and know everything about her. I want to ask you, is Mother and that Z you're finally asking?" Selene sighed and lowered her eyes slightly with a complicated expression. In the end, she nodded lightly. "Yes." Hearing this, Lan Sha's delicate body suddenly trembled. Although he had expected it, after really confirming it, his heart instantly became turbulent. He pursed his lips and forced down his chaotic thoughts. But Mother and Father. In Lan Sha's childhood memories, his father existed. He was the direct descendant of the ruler of the Battle Lions tribe. But before Lan Sha grew up, his father passed away due to illness. It was actually a political marriage to stabilize the royal power. You should have heard the rumor that when the Empress returned from Bran, she was already pregnant. He exclaimed involuntarily, the rumors are all true? And there were still some people who knew about this back then, so there was this rumor. Your Highness Lan Sha, you've grown up, and it's time for you to know these things. Although in the end, it still has to be hidden. Shaking her head, Selene seemed to not want to talk about this anymore. You can ask the Empress about the specifics, she should tell you. She paused and suddenly took a deep breath. Her expression became serious. Your Highness Lan Sha, now I just want to ask you formally. From this moment on, are you prepared? Lan Sha looked up blankly. Prepared for what? Selene frowned. Prepared to be the next Northern Wilderness Empress, of course. What? An Empress? Of course. Seeing Lan Sha turn pale with fright, Selene nodded solemnly. Actually, the rumors from back then have basically been suppressed, but after Z caused a ruckus in front of the Imperial City, this matter will inevitably be brought up again by people with ulterior motives. So, even if His Highness Tiu succeeds in returning from Bran, he can no longer be the heir of the royal family. But you're different, you're a pure Northern Wilderness person, and now only you can receive the support of all the tribes in the Northern Wilderness, and only you have the right to inherit the royal power of the royal family. I can't. He kept waving his hands and retreating. Even someone as calm as Lan Sha was turned pale with fright by this series of shocking news. He was completely dumbfounded. At this time, Selene took a strong step forward with a stern expression. Your Highness, you have no choice, say no more. He screamed loudly. Lan Sha suddenly covered his ears and instinctively turned around to run away. Selene didn't chase after him. She stood where she was and watched Lan Sha's figure gradually disappear into the distance. She muttered softly, Your Highness, you have no choice. Don't waste the Empress' efforts. In the main hall, the simple arrangements were completed. It turned out that the thing that the plump women behind the Empress had moved was actually a table with a chessboard on it. After they swiftly arranged the chess pieces and 2 chairs, Lan Sha's high-pitched scream could be heard at this time. The Empress's eyes dimmed when she heard the scream. She turned to look at the light purple armor in the innermost part of the main hall and sighed softly. Then she waved her hand and dismissed the women. She took a few steps forward and sat down on a wooden chair. She raised her head and waved her hand in an inviting gesture. Her expression was calm. "Let's play chess. If you lose, you die." Chapter 657. Let's play chess. If you lose, you die. His tone was flat and calm. It was as if once he opened his mouth, it would be an iron order that would not be moved by 10,000 mountains. No one would doubt the authenticity of his words, and the fact was indeed so. Tang En touched his nose when he heard that. He didn't try to bargain with him but simply sat in front of the chessboard. Resist? Don't be ridiculous. Ever since the Northern Wilderness Empress entered the hall, Tang En had sensed several powerful auras locking onto him. Based on his senses, he could tell that they were elites who were not weaker than Yema. Right now, this aura was still relatively stable, but Tang En had reason to believe that if he made any strange movements, or if the Empress in front of him gave the order, the other party would instantly appear and join forces to ruthlessly strangle him. The Go game was the one played by Bran. The crystal sculptures of the king, cavalry, soldiers and so on were vividly depicted in the squares. It was the kind of Go game played by Tang En and Zi when they first met. Seeing this, Tang En could not help but secretly breathe a sigh of relief. Bran had many kinds of chess skills, and he, or the system, was the only one who knew the rules of the game. Therefore, he would definitely not lose. After relaxing, Tang En couldn't help but raise his head to glance at the Empress. He felt slightly amused. If they weren't a family, they wouldn't enter the same house. This international couple is really interesting. Do they always greet each other with a game of chess when they meet each other? Without any discussion, the Empress took the lead and pushed out a soldier with an expressionless face. Tang En didn't seem to care at all. He followed suit and pushed a soldier. I'll let you go first. I'm used to being the last to strike. Of course, the truth was that the system had to go through countless calculations to come up with a few countermeasures against the opponent's moves. That's right, it was a cheat. At the beginning of the game, both sides were still in the stage of probing and building momentum. Naturally, there would be very little killing intent on the surface. Thus, after a few peaceful moves, the queen raised her head and said calmly, "You've played chess with Z before? Tell me about the situation." Although it was a question, the undeniable meaning behind it was very obvious. Tang En shrugged his shoulders indifferently when he heard that. He rubbed his chin and recalled, "I did, but only once. And it was last year, the exact time, it was God's Grace Day, in Shanghai City. At that time..." The Empress's hand that was holding the flag suddenly paused, and her expression became extremely complicated in an instant. Reminiscence, disappointment, joy. But it only lasted for a few short breaths before she completely restrained herself. Her eyelids drooped slightly, and she interrupted Tang En's words, "And you won." Yes. Our bet was a jade pendant, but This is it, right? F***ck. Rude, can't you let me finish my words? Of course, this could only be a silent criticism. Tang En curled his lips and raised his head. He looked at the familiar wolf-shaped jade pendant in the Empress's hand, and his expression couldn't help but be stunned. He subconsciously nodded and said, "That's right. It seems like you guys are really..." Before he finished speaking, Tang En stopped himself in time. This wasn't something that anyone could say, and he might lose his life. However, that jade pendant was indeed very similar to the one that Tang En had obtained from Z. The only difference was that the one in the Empress's hand was the other half. Holding the jade pendant tightly, the Empress's expression suddenly darkened. She narrowed her eyes, which were as sharp as knives, and said, "It really is you." As soon as she finished speaking, Tang En's body suddenly tensed up, like a bow that was fully drawn, ready to shoot at any moment. Just a moment ago, Tang En suddenly felt an ice-cold killing intent from the Empress's body. At the same time, the temperature in the silent main hall plummeted, and the air suddenly became extremely sticky. Without a doubt, the tyrannical auras hidden in the dark instantly locked onto Tang En, ready to attack. There was no reason, and there was no need for a reason. It was just that the Empress was angry, and the current situation appeared. Tang En's face paled, and his breathing became extremely long. Large drops of sweat slowly flowed down from the hair on his temples. No one could imagine the mountain-like pressure that Tang En was currently shouldering. However, even so, Tang En's expression still didn't change. He looked straight into the Empress's cold gaze. He seemed to be stunned, but in fact, he was ready to pounce and kill. At this time, Tang En didn't even have time to think about whether he could walk out of here alive. The only thing he was thinking about was whether he could kill the Northern Wilderness Empress before he died and earn back his money first. Just as the seventh drop of sweat flowed down from Tang En's temples, the Empress lowered her head slightly, covered her cold gaze, and reached out to push out a chess piece. The killing intent disappeared. The sticky atmosphere in the main hall was instantly swept away, as if it had never appeared. Phew! Exhaling softly, Tang En licked his dry lips and looked deeply at the Empress. Then, he lowered his head and calmly pushed out a chess piece. Although both of them acted as if they didn't care, the Empress really didn't care, and Tang En was a little aggrieved. The current situation was like this. As long as Tang En didn't want to die, he couldn't do something like turn hostile on the spot. However, this didn't mean that Tang En would just endure it. He admitted that with the Northern Wilderness Empress's power, killing him would be as easy as crushing an ant. However, there were many ways to counterattack in the system space. Tang En's figure flashed and disappeared, leaving only a cold voice echoing. From now on, only the move to completely eat the opponent's head. The so-called eat the opponent's head was a method of eating all the opponent's flags first, and then finally killing the king. This was the most inhumane result in a chess game. Often, it would make the person who was eaten angry and embarrassed to the point of wanting to flip the table. In the beginning, Tang En wouldn't do such a thing to the Empress, even if it was for Zi's sake. However, now, although he couldn't afford to offend her, he still had to collect interest. The Empress naturally didn't know what Tang En was thinking. She just said calmly, "You seem to know a lot of things." "That's right, more than 10 years ago, Zi and I were lovers. The first time we met was in Shanghai City. It was also Grace Day at that time, and there were many people and it was very lively. It was a beautiful scene that I couldn't see in the Northern Wilderness, but in the midst of playing, I found that my wallet was stolen." Tang En raised his eyebrows and looked at the Empress, who seemed to be reminiscing. He wasn't sure if she was talking to him or if she was talking to herself. In the end, he just listened in silence. Later, I came up with the idea of setting up a chess stall, and the bet was the royal jade pendant that I always wore. It was a bit rash, but I didn't think that anyone could beat me at that time. However, the funny thing was that those brand people didn't know what was good for them. After half a day, the chess stall still didn't have any customers. It wasn't until I put up a banner saying, "The brand's second chess player, the first chess player has not been decided," that business gradually became lively. F***ck. Tang En's mouth couldn't help but twitch when he heard this. He finally knew where Zi's extremely arrogant banner came from. I set up the chess stall for 3 days, and the result was just as I expected. None of the brand people could beat me. Until I met Zi. We played from noon to evening, and in the end, I still lost. The wolf jade pendant was also taken by him. This jade pendant is very important, so I proposed to exchange it with other things, but Zi didn't agree, so I could only think of ways to pester him. Who knew that things would turn out like this? At this point, the Empress was lost in thought. Her eyes were a bit absent-minded in the dim light of the main hall, as if she had thought of something, and a sweet taste appeared in her heart. After a while, the Empress came back to her senses and shook her head slightly. She glossed over the matter and said indifferently, "What happened after was a bit complicated. Every year on Grace Day, Z would set up a chess stall in Shanghai City. I know about this. Let's consider it an agreement. We tacitly agreed to let fate decide everything. Haha, now that I think about it, fate is really a good thing. It's a good excuse. If no one could beat him, he wouldn't see me for the rest of his life. Of course, with his level, as long as he didn't go easy on me, I really couldn't think of anyone who could beat him. That's the truth, and the past 10 years have passed just like that. Our fate started on the chessboard, and our fate ended on the chessboard. It's not a bad ending, but..." Pause for a while. The Empress raised her head and stared at Tang En, her faint killing intent flowing again. "The world is like a game of chess, and the game is about to reach its end. But you just had to appear, and you even beat Z. Because of you, he didn't care about his own safety and stepped out of the grand border city, traveled thousands of miles, and killed Anglos. Then, he went through countless tribes and destroyed all the way to the imperial city, and finally died in front of me. You deserve to die." The more she spoke, the more anxious she became. She pressed forward with the chessboard, and her killing intent and aura were released without any restraint. Her delicate facial features were somewhat vicious. Tang En was completely dumbfounded. He blankly wiped the cold sweat off his forehead and muttered in a low voice, "What the F***ck is going on? Isn't it just winning a game of chess?" Chapter 658. Just by winning a game of chess, a war broke out. Then, he killed the commander of the Northern Wilderness, hastened the death of Bran, and finally changed the direction of the war, causing the Northern Wilderness to have no choice but to retreat. At this moment, the figure of a high school politics teacher in the modern world suddenly appeared in Tang En's mind. It was a middle-aged man with glasses that looked like the bottom of a wine bottle. He held a book and read in a cadence, "Students, everything is connected. The various parts and elements of things are interconnected. The world is a universal and organic whole. Damn. You're very lucky." Just as Tang En was dizzy, the Empress retracted her leaning body and straightened her body. Her face was expressionless. "If it weren't for your relationship with him and the fact that you saved Lan Shah's life, you would have been dead already. The moment you stepped into the imperial city, you would have become a corpse." Of course, this threat was not just empty words. If it weren't for the above reasons, perhaps the fact that Tang En indirectly caused Z's death in front of the imperial city would have been enough for the Empress to kill Tang En 1,000 times over. However, the current Tang En did not care about this. Other than shock, he did not feel any guilt. Originally, he just happened to be there at the right time. There were many causes and effects in the world. Tang En did not think that he was a saint, so naturally, he would not take all the responsibility. Taking a deep breath, Tang En barely suppressed the thousands of waves in his heart. He carefully looked at the game in front of him. This game won't have any serious consequences, right? He was really a little scared. Although he did not care, if he knew that there would be such consequences, he would not have casually won that game of chess against Z for the sake of this advanced cultivation method. The Empress looked indifferent. "I've already said that if you lose, you will die." Based on her understanding of Z, she did not think that he would deliberately let Tang En win. However, everything had to be witnessed with her own eyes. Therefore, if Twain lost, then no matter what the reason was, just based on the consequences, the Empress would definitely kill Twain. However, although the Empress had made up her mind to kill him, Tang En heaved a long sigh of relief. "Phew, that's good. Lose? What a joke." With the help of the system, Tang En was not afraid at all even if the Empress was tied to Z. Queen's expression instantly darkened. Of course, she didn't know that Tang En had the help of a cheat. Hearing this, she only felt that it was incomparably unpleasant. Actually, in the eyes of an expert, one could tell how good a person's chess skills were just by looking at the previous setup. Thus, the queen had to admit that Arthur's chess skills were indeed unfathomable. Every move he made seemed to be following the rules of the game, but if one were to carefully analyze his moves, they would be flawless and perfect. Just based on this opening, in addition to his relationship with Z and Lan Sha, the Empress had the thought of letting him go. But now the Empress suddenly realized that this guy in front of her was very annoying. She would feel better if he was dead. Thus, after staring deeply at Tang En, the Empress pursed her lips tightly and officially pushed a cavalry across the center line. The game entered the middle, and the killing intent was suddenly apparent. Of course, Tang En didn't know what the Empress was thinking. Or rather, even if he knew, he wouldn't care. Let me go? Hee, don't mess around. I'm going to eat you bald. The Empress's intelligence was outstanding, and her reaction speed was extremely fast. Tang En had the help of the system, so his thinking never exceeded 5 seconds. Back and forth, killing moves were made one after another. Soon, the two sides' flags were entangled in the middle of the chessboard. From time to time, a flag was swept out of the game. After all, there was a limit to human strength. Gradually, the Empress' thinking time became longer and longer. Tang En was still playing fast chess. He didn't even look at the chessboard when he had the time. Instead, he picked up a teacup and blew on it. From time to time, he would take a sip, looking like a leisurely landlord. Haha, tremble, mortal. How can the wisdom of this young master be something that you lowly humans can compare to? It was in such a relaxed state that Tang En's mind gradually became active. He said casually, "Oh, by the way, did you know that Z was poisoned?" Although Tang En and Z hadn't known each other for long, he still respected him. Besides, even if it was because of the super-powerful weapon Z gave him, Tang En didn't mind helping him. He believed that as long as he pointed out that Z was poisoned, the Empress would definitely send people to track down and kill the person who poisoned him, based on the fact that she obviously still had feelings for him. The Empress didn't even raise her head. "I know. I decided to poison him when I came back from Bran." Tang En was dumbfounded when he heard this. He looked at the Empress in a daze and couldn't say a word. A moment later, the Empress was relieved when she saw the chess piece. She looked up and saw Tang En's expression. She said, "At that time, Bran's army was strong and their morale was high. Z was like the sun in the sky, and all the generals respected him. They unanimously decided to train their troops and attack the northern wilderness. At that time, my father's life was in danger. His only son, which was me, couldn't return from Bran. It was inevitable that all the forces in the tribe were eager to take the throne from the hands of the serious royal family." She shook her head slightly. "Faced with internal and external troubles, my father sent me a letter, threatening me with death. I didn't have a choice, did I?" Although the Empress didn't mention the specific situation at that time, Tang En could naturally imagine the dilemma the Empress was in at that time. On one side, there was the safety of her family, the great cause of the tribe, and the throne of the northern wilderness. On the other side, there was the person she loved deeply. Now, both sides were in a state of hostility, and she was the only one in the middle. Before I left, I poisoned the soup. It was a kind of mixed poison unique to the Sirius royal family. There are only a few antidotes in this world, and then I watched him drink it with my own eyes. That's it. It's your turn to play chess." Tang En came back to his senses and flashed out of the system space. He casually played a chess piece, and then looked at the Empress in silence. He really didn't know what to say, and he didn't have the right to say it. He could only change the topic. He forced a smile and said, "It seems that the mixed poison unique to your tribe is not very effective. Z hasn't died for more than 10 years. The Empress looked down at the chessboard and shook her head. "It's not the problem of the poison. Although it's a slow-acting poison, without a special antidote, it wouldn't have lasted for more than 10 years. Pause for a while, she frowned and thought about the chess piece. She said faintly, I secretly sent people to move a few northern wilderness plants to Bran on a large scale, and then spread the recipe. Although it can't be used to detoxify the poison, it can suppress the spread of the poison for a long time. Tang En opened his mouth, but he didn't come back to his senses for a long time. On one hand, she was the one who poisoned him. She was ruthless. On the other hand, she was afraid that he would die and send the antidote, and because she was worried that he would be upset and not accept it, she secretly sent the antidote. His mind was a bit messy. He spread his hand. If you didn't want him to die, why didn't you just send him the antidote? He always had the antidote, but I didn't tell him, so he didn't know. The Empress made another move. She narrowed her eyes and said, "The Bran is too strong." Although on the surface, it seemed that the northern wilderness was suppressing the Bran. But behind this seemingly strong force, it was actually more and more powerlessness that couldn't be hidden. If this Bran was combined with a healthy Z, the northern wilderness would have been devoured more than 10 years ago. That's why I didn't tell him where the antidote was. I never told him. Shaking her head slightly, the Empress picked up the jade pendant and rubbed it. She opened her palm. Actually, the antidote is in the jade pendant. You can get it by smashing it. Looking up at the stunned Tang En, the Empress's lips curled into a faint smile. Haha, I'm ruthless. I knew he was getting weaker day by day, but I didn't tell him that the antidote was actually with him. In the end, I just watched him slowly die. I don't think so, he stuttered. The reason Tang En was stunned just now wasn't because the antidote was unexpectedly in the jade pendant. It was because when he saw the Empress rubbing the jade pendant, he suddenly felt that this scene was very familiar, as if he had seen it somewhere before. It was beside the Seliaguna River. When he was talking to Z, he had once asked if the other party had the antidote. At that time, Z had also rubbed the jade pendant and said with a complicated expression, "Maybe." Then, he had handed the jade pendant to him. Now that he thought about it, Tang En was sure that Z should have known that the antidote was in the jade pendant. As for why he didn't take it, it wasn't necessary. Seeing the jade pendant reminded him of her, so he couldn't bear to part with it? Or use his own life to take revenge for her resolute departure more than 10 years ago, making the Empress regret it for the rest of her life? He didn't know, and he couldn't guess. Tang En was really speechless about this extremely complicated emotional entanglement. He could only be sure of one thing now, and that was that since Z didn't resent the Empress until the end, then he really didn't care or understand her actions. Therefore, Tang En respected Z's opinion and repeated with certainty, "It doesn't count." Chapter 659. Amidst the conversations that rang out from time to time in the silent hall, the battle on the chessboard gradually became clearer. The previous entanglement in the middle was officially broken after the queen lost a few chess pieces. Now, Twain's black chess pieces took advantage of the victory and entered with an unstoppable momentum. On the other hand, the defense line that the queen had no choice but to set up with her white chess pieces was like a candle in the wind, in imminent danger. This situation was within his expectations. Queen's intelligence was very high, and her reaction speed was also very fast. However, when she encountered a bug like Twain who carried a cheat, she could only helplessly admit defeat like Z had done earlier. The so-called difference was just a matter of how long she could last. Tang En did not tell the queen that Z knew that the antidote was in the jade pendant, although he was almost certain that the queen would be in a state of regret for the rest of her life after hearing it. This would allow him to vent his depression just now. However, Tang En respected Z. Since this infatuated man did not say anything in the end, he naturally did not need to say anything. Of course, not saying anything did not mean that he could completely understand. At least from Tang En's point of view, he still felt that Ziyi's ending was too tragic. She had traveled thousands of miles with her injured body and finally arrived at the gates of the royal palace, but she could not see her old lover. This was really cruel. She pushed out the flag and mercilessly destroyed one of the enemy's cavalrymen. As far as I know, Z once shouted 3 times outside the imperial city to come out and see me, but you did not come out. You only met him once. Why? The queen frowned as she watched her cavalry chess piece leave the field. That was one of her few hopes of turning the tables. She pursed her lips and said, I did not meet him, and he caused the only large-scale rebellion in the imperial city in 10 years. What do you think will happen if I meet him? At least he can die without regrets. Meaningful? Tang Yin's eyes flickered, and a mocking smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. Haha, in the end, it is still for the benefit of the royal family? Raising her head to look at Tang Yin, a hint of anger flashed in the Empress's eyes. However, she calmed down immediately and said calmly, That's right. You can call me cruel and heartless, blinded by greed, and so on. I admit to all these because this is the truth. He laughed and shook his head. Ha, I'm in no position to scold you. My little life is still in your hands. He knew when to stop. Going too far was as bad as falling short. There was no problem in mocking the Empress a little. This was also to gain some psychological balance between himself and Z. However, if he went overboard, it would be a path to death. Tang Yin would not do that. It's good that you know, humph. As soon as he finished speaking, the Empress suddenly snorted coldly, and her gaze shot over fiercely like a blade. On the other hand, Tang Yin looked indifferent as he moved his black knight away from the White King, as if he did not feel anything. As long as that knight chess piece took one more step, it would be able to force the abdication of the throne. However, Tang Yin took it away at this critical moment. His intention of eating Bald Head was obvious. This undoubtedly made the Empress extremely angry. After all, the humiliation in it was too obvious. However, this was also the beauty of the game of chess. As long as one sat down and became a chess player, at least in the game, there would be no difference in status, and there would be no need to play trick. Winner takes all. Everything depended on one's own ability. If she was annoyed, she would be seen as a sore loser. Undoubtedly, she would be despised even more. The Empress obviously understood this. She narrowed her eyes, lowered her head, and stared at the chessboard again, lost in thought. Since he had lost face on the chessboard, he naturally had to get it back on the chessboard. Although eating Bald Head felt good, it was still very difficult to do so unless there was a huge gap between the chess skills of the two sides. If she forced herself to do so, it was not uncommon for her to be overturned in one fell swoop. Therefore, although the Empress admitted that this Arthur was very good at chess, she definitely did not think that she would be easily eaten bald like a novice. He furrowed his brows and swore in his heart that he must teach this guy a lesson. However, it was a pity. Following that, the game of chess did not change because of the Empress's one-sided ruthlessness. No matter what she planned, even if she wanted to set a small trap, it would be easily seen through after 1 or 2 moves. Sometimes she would even have a flash of inspiration. Previously, she had not thought of a clever move at all, but after she made the move, she realized that her opponent had already considered it and easily solved it. There were no flaws, no loopholes, no opportunities. There was only deep despair. Holding the chess piece for a long time, the Empress unconsciously bit her lip, but she could not put it down. She now felt that she had fallen into a boundless quagmire. Any struggle would be futile. On the contrary, every movement would cause her to sink deeper. There was no hope of escape at all. Haha! Tang Yin was expressionless. He held back his laughter as he looked at the situation on the chessboard. He knew that if they surrounded and killed the moving chess piece in the Empress's hand, eating Bald Head would be right in front of them. Phew! Squeezing the chess piece again, the Empress suddenly exhaled softly. She looked up with an indifferent expression. Previously, when Lan Sha reported back, he said that Z had a message for you to bring to me? Tang did not expect that she was still thinking about this. He could not help but be stunned. He nodded subconsciously. Yes, I almost forgot. In fact, there is only one sentence. He asked me to ask you, loved before? Have you ever loved before? Tang opened his mouth and was stunned for a long time. In the end, he was speechless and fell silent. Tang had actually seen this scene on the modern world's internet. The frequency was very high, but the so-called feeling was often just a smile. Perhaps because he had not experienced it personally, the faint sadness was like scratching an itch through a boot. It was not beautiful, but now, listening to the slowly echoing sigh in the dim hall, when it entered his ears, it was like a morning bell that went straight to the depths of his heart. His lonely heart could not help but be moved. He was not moved by the Empress' wisdom, but by the subtle tacit understanding between the Empress and Z. How deep did one have to be able to touch this realm? It was unimaginable. A moment later, it was this kind of shock that made Tang stand up and walk out of the hall when he heard the Empress waving her hand and saying, "I am a little tired. You can go out." When he stepped out of the hall, a cold wind hit him. Tang's mind was instantly clear. Then, his body shook violently. He turned back with an incredulous face and pointed at the end of the chessboard with trembling fingers. Damn it! Shameless! As said just now, the chessboard had to be recovered from within the chessboard. Now that the chessboard was broken, Tang naturally could not do anything because it would be an insult to the Empress. It was a completely suicidal behavior. Shaking his head, Tang left with the shock and some dissatisfaction in his heart. Well, no matter what, his life was saved. After a while, outside the hall, the Empress walked out with a calm expression. She looked at Serene, who was waiting quietly, and asked, "Have you told her?" "Yes." Serene nodded. The relationship between the Empress and Z, as well as the fact that she is the only one qualified to inherit the throne, has been told. Lan Sha is a little unable to accept it. He may resent you because of this. The Empress said indifferently, "Don't worry about this. It will be fine." Actually, Celine's lips moved slightly. She wanted to say something but stopped. Then, she hesitated and said, "Actually, as long as the Empress supports and lets her know her true identity." "Shut up!" the Empress shouted decisively. She suddenly turned her head and looked at Serene with a cold expression. The latter bowed and lowered her head to admit her guilt. Knowing that Serene was thinking for her, the Empress' tone softened. "Serene, some things are better done by one person than by two people. Since Lan Sha does not know, then isn't it better to be a person of the northern wilderness for the rest of his life?" Serene lowered her head and said, "Yes." "Well, then that's it. I will take a walk alone." The Empress waved her hand to refuse everyone's company and walked away. Seeing the still dignified figure disappear behind the corner of the wall, Serene shook her head slightly and sighed. "This is good for Lan Sha, but what about you, the Empress?" Passing through the palace and walking through the corridors, the Empress walked absent-mindedly for about 10 minutes as if she did not see the servants and guards who kept bowing to her. She came to a building made of hard black stone at the back of the castle. This was the Empress' personal library. She also dealt with some national affairs here. So, the security was tight and it was abnormally quiet. No one was allowed to enter or leave. She pushed the door open and entered. Rows of bookshelves were neatly placed. The room was filled with the dusty smell of ancient books. Stepping into a remote corner, the Empress seemed to have touched something, and her figure suddenly disappeared in an instant. When she reappeared, she was already underground. This was a large hall. The light blue illuminating crystals on the walls gave off a faint light. Inside, one could only feel a chill. And the source of this chill was the glazed ice coffin in the center of the hall. The material of the ice coffin was needless to say. There was not a single drop of water seeping out of it. It was obvious that it was not an ordinary item. When she arrived here, the Empress' dignified expression suddenly collapsed. It was replaced by the sadness of a little girl. Her eyes were slightly red. She slowly walked closer and touched the ice coffin with her jade hand. She looked at the man lying in the ice coffin with a devilishly beautiful face. It was Z. It was rumored that Z was burned to ashes together with the main hall of the Northern Wilderness Imperial Palace in the fire. Drip. A teardrop fell and smashed into the ice layer, breaking into tiny droplet. I am sorry, but for our child, I can't see you. I really can't. Woo, her sobs echoed in the secret room. It was sad and melancholic, and it did not stop for a long time. Chapter 660. A few days later, in the early morning of the end of winter, pushing open the window on the second floor, snowflakes fell from the sky. Nobody knew when it started last night. Now the snow had completely fallen. Looking into the distance, the world was pure white. Fortunately, this was inside the city. With the towering city wall as a barrier, there was not much cold wind blowing in, and the temperature was not unbearably low. In this kind of weather, if it was in the Bran, not many people would be willing to go out. However, this was the northern wilderness. So, even though it was still early, he could see many people moving around in the high vantage point. In front of the neighbor's house on the left, a few people dressed as servants were cleaning the snow. One of them inadvertently looked up and was stunned. He quickly stood up straight and bowed from afar. Looking away, in front of him was the backyard of a rather luxurious building in the northern wilderness. Through the iron fence, he could see two barbarians wrestling in the snow. One was a tall and strong adult man, and the other was a short and stout child. In the snowy sky, the two of them were only wearing a short animal skin around their waist. They were naked. Then, the adult man grabbed the child's leg, lifted him up, and threw him down. Bang! The sound of the child falling to the ground was heard, and snowflakes flew everywhere. The child quickly climbed up from the snow, roared, and quickly jumped up. Then, he was lifted up again and thrown down. Phew! Tang En exhaled a breath of white air. Although his clothes were thin, he did not feel much coldness. Instead, his mind became clearer. Looking at the wrestling that was more like torture, Tang En could not help but shake his head slightly and said to himself, "No wonder the Bran soldiers can't defeat the barbarians in the northern wilderness. In such an environment, with such an extreme training method since young, it would be strange if they could defeat them." As soon as he finished speaking, there was a knock on the door behind him. "Come in." Tang En turned around and opened the door. A slightly obese middle-aged woman walked in. When she saw Tang En, she bowed and said, "Sir, breakfast is ready." "Okay, thank you, Aunt Zhenli. I'll clean up and go down." "Sir, you don't have to thank me. This is what I should do." Aunt Zhenli bowed again, looking a little frightened. Oh. When Tang En saw this, he couldn't help but rub his eyebrows, looking a little troubled. He could only pull a long face and wave his hand. Only then did Aunt Zhenli carefully close the door and leave. I'm really born to be a loser. I can't be a landlord." With a bitter smile, Tang En shook his head, closed the window, and went to pick up the black animal skin cloak hanging at the side. It had already been 3 days since his last meeting with the Empress. With Tang En's status, it was naturally impossible for him to live in the palace. However, in just one afternoon, before he even came out of the castle, his residence had already been arranged. It was a 2-story stone building with a majestic appearance. Behind it was a large courtyard with a basement, tool room, woodland, and so on. The specific location was around the castle. Needless to say, just by looking at the buildings in the northern wilderness that were equally rich and expensive, Tang En knew that the location of his house was very good. Not only that, just after he moved into this somewhat excessive stone building, André came with Zhenli and more than a dozen servants the next day. He smilingly arranged for them to live in the stone building and take care of his daily life. Oh, I forgot to mention, Tang En only knew then that Andre's true identity was the royal guard captain in charge of guarding the periphery of the palace. From his mouth, Tang En knew that all of this was arranged by Lan Sha, including Zhen Li and more than a dozen brand servants who spoke the brand language and obviously put in a lot of effort to gather them. However, as mentioned earlier, Tang En was really not used to being served like a landlord, so he directly refused. However, Andre said that this was His Highness Lan Sha's arrangement and that he was just following orders. He also said that these brand servants did not have a good life here and that no one in the northern wilderness was willing to hire them. As a brand, shouldn't Arthur take care of his compatriots? Moreover, they don't need to be paid by the palace every month. What else could Tang En say now that things had come to this point? He could only rub his nose and smile bitterly. Of course, if you want to get something, you have to give something. In fact, today was Tang En's day of work. The location was a place called the Craftsman's Workshop. As for the content of the work, it was naturally to make glasses and binoculars. At this point, Lan Sha did not need Tang En's consent to recruit him. Naturally, they reached an agreement. There was no other way. Tang En really did not have the leeway to refuse, unless he wanted to leave the stone building and go to the Imperial City prison for a few days to see the punishment in the northern wilderness. Walking down to the bedroom on the second floor, Tang En went to the dining room with a stiff expression after the servants who were cleaning the place bowed and greeted him. He could not be blamed for being rude because if he returned the greeting, these servants would be terrified for a while. Tang En could also guess the reason. No matter how these brand people came here, there was no doubt that in this northern wilderness land, their status was at the lowest level of society. Their lives were really as bad as Andre said. Being beaten and scolded was considered a light punishment. Even if they were killed, no one would care. Could be said that these people now followed Tang En, which was the best outcome. Not only did they not have to worry about food and clothing, but they even had a monthly salary. In any case, although Tang En was also a brand, it was not wrong for him to live in this area where the rich and powerful live. So even if it was for Tang En's sake, the northern wilderness people outside did not dare to touch them easily. As a result, their attitude towards Tang En was naturally very respectful. They were afraid that they would accidentally annoy him and lose this good job that seemed to be blessed by the god of light. On the dining table, the food that was obviously brand style had already been prepared. Golden slices of dough, fragrant cheese, and slices of meat on top of the meat, and so on. They were placed on exquisite plates and filled one side of the table. Pulling out a chair and sitting down, Tang En looked at the overly rich breakfast in front of him and could not help but smack his lips. TSK, corruption, corruption, Lan Sha, what are you thinking? Are you trying to defeat me with these sugar-coated bullets? But why are there so many uncles and aunties? Why don't you send me a few good-looking lowly maids? Ahem, I'm thinking the wrong way, Tang En, you have to hold on, you can't bend over for 5 buckets of rice. But I'm not a bran, why should I hold on? Sigh, I'm thinking too much. After habitually letting his imagination run wild for a while, Tang En picked up the knife and fork and started to eat. It's a waste if I don't eat. I'm now a skilled worker and I'm contributing labor. After about 10 minutes, Tang En burped and leaned on the chair. He wiped his mouth with a white towel contentedly. He was very satisfied. It had to be said that such a superior life really made people have the desire to fall. At this time, a series of heavy footsteps came from outside the door. Tang En looked up and saw a barbarian in a slightly heavy armor walking into the dining room. Aunt Zhen Li and others around him subconsciously avoided him. They were also guards sent by Andre. There were nearly 100 of them, and they were responsible for the safety of the surrounding area. Of course, they should also have the order to monitor Tang En. After a simple salute, the barbarian said in a very stiff brand language, "Sir Arthur, there's an old brand man named Matthew outside the door looking for you." "Matthew man?" Tang En was slightly startled when he heard this, and then he understood. Today was the first time he went to work at the craftsman's workshop. He was unfamiliar with the place and the people. Andre said before that someone would inform him. It seemed that it was this Matthew man. He's considerate. He even specially found a bran. Thinking of this, Tang En shook his head and laughed. He got up and said, "Let's go out together. After all, he's the first customer." Yes. These guards should have been instructed by Andre. They probably knew about Tang En's strength, so they were respectful to him, at least on the surface. Through the front hall and out of the empty front courtyard, Tang En saw an ordinary black carriage parked on the side of the door through the iron fence. The door was open, and there was a thin old man with a 1-foot white beard wearing a gray cotton-padded jacket sitting inside. At this time, the old man was staring at the guards in the snow outside the door with a strange expression. He did not realize that it was Tang En who walked out of the iron gate. As he got closer, Tang En heard the old man muttering something about royal guards. He was a little confused, so he stepped forward and greeted, "Hello, are you Sir Matthew Man?" "Yes, hello." The old man named Matthew Man was shocked when he heard the greeting. He seemed to be frightened and a little flustered. After he reacted, his old face could not help but blush. He returned the greeting and said, "Ahem, you must be Sir Arthur. I'm Matthew Man from the craftsman's workshop. I'm here to take you to the workplace." "You?" Tang En could not help but grin when he heard the honorific. He said with a smile, "Sir Matthew Man, you're too polite. You and I are both from the Bran. I'm new here and don't know anything. Please take care of me." "Haha, it's my pleasure, it's my pleasure," Matthew Man responded with a dry smile. When he looked at the burly man's armor next to Tang En again, his eyes could not help but shrink. There was a look of awe on his face. Tang En was very observant, so he also looked at the burly man's armor in surprise. However, other than the wolf head on the armor, he did not find anything special. Then the two exchanged a few more pleasantries, but because Matthew Man's attitude was still a little awkward, the atmosphere was a little cold. Matthew Man seemed to realize this as well, so he simply ended the conversation and proposed to go to the craftsman's workshop. Tang En naturally did not object. He was about to find the right words to ride with Matthew Man and learn more about the situation in the Imperial City so that he could make plans for his escape in the future. At this time, the burly man who had been following them suddenly pursed his lips and let out a sharp howl. Beat! Da-da-da! As soon as the howl ended, the crisp sound of hooves could be heard. At the corner of the iron gate, 4 horses with pure white fur and light blue vertical eyes slowly walked out. Their silver hooves were lightly trotting, and their postures were elegant. Immediately, behind the 2 coachmen who were also wearing wolf head armor, a pure black carriage with crystal windows flashing with light and a golden wave-like mysterious pattern on the top came into view. Tang En and Matthew Man were stunned at the same time. They stared blankly at the gorgeous carriage that slowly came to their side and did not come back to their senses for a long time. The burly man on the side explained, "Sir Arthur, time is a little tight, and your carriage is not ready yet. Therefore, His Highness Lan Sha will lend His Highness Tiu's carriage to you for the time being." As soon as his voice fell, the pure white horse snorted and raised its head high. The mottled old horse in front of Matthew's carriage couldn't help but take a few steps to the side when it heard the sound, like a little wife who had been bullied. After coming back to his senses, Tang En turned to look at the stupefied Matthew. He couldn't help but touch his nose and smile bitterly. Damn it! Isn't this a little too high profile? Chapter 661. Clatter, clatter, clatter. The sound of horse hooves mixed with the sound of rolling wheels could be heard. An ordinary carriage with a black shed was moving along the side of the road at a leisurely pace. Inside the carriage, the 2 men sat opposite each other, and the atmosphere was a little stiff. After a moment, One person took the lead to break the silence and greeted, "Ahem, Sir Matthew, may I ask where you are from in Bran?" You can call me Matthew, hee." Matthew replied carefully. He laughed, "Haha, okay, then I won't be polite. I'll call you Elder Ma. Since we are all from Bran, then there's no need to talk about honorific. You have the final say." He was speechless. "I already said there's no need for honorifics." Yes. You're right. Damn, how am I supposed to talk?" Rubbing his eyebrows, Tangan leaned against the wall of the carriage with a helpless expression. The carriage they were in now was Matthew's, and it was heading to the craftsman's office. Although Tangan did not choose to sit in the unusually flashy royal carriage in the end, what he had seen and heard before undoubtedly put a lot of pressure on Matthew. Now, he was sitting upright with a cautious expression, and he did not dare to speak at all at this time. How could Tang En not understand Lan Shah's plan? The extraordinary two-story stone building, the guards of the Heavenly Wolf imperial family who were in charge of security, and the extravagant carriage from before. All of these things had a similar meaning to what André had told him before entering the city. It was nothing more than to prevent people from provoking him and interfering with the research progress of telescopes and other things. It was just that Lan Shah did it more thoroughly. He directly took out His Highness Tiu's carriage and used his royal status to suppress people and cut off all the hidden dangers in one fell swoop. It had to be said that this was really that little girl's style of doing things. But, after thinking it through, Tang En secretly shook his head. He would have to run away sooner or later, so the more low-key he was, the better. How could he sit in that royal carriage in a high-profile manner? While pondering, Tang En looked at Matthew, whose figure was a little stiff, and sighed inwardly. He had to give up the idea of inquiring about the situation of the imperial city for the time being. Instead, he smiled and said, "Elder Ma, are you also from the craftsman's office? Then we will be colleagues in the future. Can you give me a brief introduction of this craftsman's workshop?" "Of course, no problem." Well, the so-called craftsman's workshop was actually somewhat similar to Bran's alchemist guild. However, the research subjects here are not so detailed. Regardless of whether it is the most important battlefield weapons or living farming tools, they are all researched and manufactured together. When it came to what he was good at, Matthew's nervousness eased a little. He gestured and spoke more fluently. After a while, Tang En finally had a general understanding of the craftsman. First of all, after Lan Shah's mother, the current Northern Wilderness Empress, ascended to the position, the originally inconspicuous craftsman's workshop was greatly expanded. Now, its status was not low. As for the system and function of this organization, as Matthew said, it was very similar to Bran's alchemist guild. In other words, when the craftsman's workshop was first established, it should be copied from the alchemist guild. Speaking of which, he had to praise the current Northern Wilderness Empress. She was indeed worthy of being called a leader who had seen the world. Although on the surface she was fighting fiercely with Bran, and they were incompatible like fire and water. But when she turned around, she effortlessly used all kinds of advanced Bran culture, concepts, and so on, including the popular Bran language that was more suitable for communication, recording, and circulation, as well as the current pirated alchemist guild, craftsmen, and so on. But of course, using the same model did not mean that they could reach the same height. In fact, because of the lack of professional talents, the pitiful amount of research materials, and other subjective and objective reasons, the Alchemist Guild's workshop was completely different from the Alchemist Guild. The craftsmen couldn't be compared to the Alchemist Guild, which had a perfect system. Now it was still a mess. They wanted to study any subject, but after reaching a certain stage, they were awkwardly stuck and could only turn to another project. Of course, although it was a bit messy, there was no doubt that it was useful. For example, the example that Matthew had just mentioned. Previously, the barbarians in the northern wilderness basically did not wear armor. It was not that they did not want to wear armor, but that they really did not have a complete armor manufacturing process. But with all kinds of efforts by the craftsmen, such as secretly capturing a few famous Bran craftsmen and constantly splitting up the smuggled Bran armor at a high price, finally, the Northern Wilderness had its own set of armor manufacturing process, and now it was slowly popularizing. The wolf head armor worn by the royal guards around Tang En's stone building was one of the most outstanding armor manufacturing processes. Hearing this, Tang En could not help but laugh and shake his head, thinking to himself, "Ha, this Northern Wilderness Empress is a person who does great things after all. Look at how thick-skinned she is." Just as Matthew's expression was getting more and more relaxed, Tang En also took the opportunity to ask curiously, "Why did Elder Ma come to the Northern Wilderness? Were you captured?" "That's not it." Matthew was stunned for a moment and shook his head. "I used to be a level 2 alchemist who studied metals in the Bran. Because of an experiment, more than a dozen colleagues were killed. In fact, the one who presided over the experiment was not me, and it was not my turn to be in charge of such a large-scale experiment. But I was lucky enough to survive, and the one who really presided over the experiment was a guy with a noble background, so in the end I was the scapegoat. According to the Empire's law, the lightest punishment for someone like me is to spend the rest of my life in prison. I had no choice but to run. After a few twists and turns, I finally ended up here in the Northern Wilderness." "Ha." With a sarcastic smile, Matthew's muddy old eyes were a little melancholy. "In the blink of an eye, more than 20 years have passed. At that time, I was in a hurry to escape and couldn't care about my family. I don't know if my wife is still there, and my youngest daughter, Alice. Oh, she should be married now. I don't know if she still remembers me." In the midst of the sigh, the atmosphere in the carriage was a little heavy. Tang En saw this and lowered his eyes slightly. "Sorry, Elder Ma, I shouldn't have mentioned this." "Oh, it's okay." After coming back to his senses, Matthew inadvertently wiped the corner of his eyes. "In fact, it's all in the past. It's only when I see you, Mr. Arthur, that I can't help but think of the Bran's past and say a few more words." He waved his hand to indicate that it didn't matter, and then his spirit was lifted as he said, "Fortunately, because the current Empress came to power, she began to pay attention to people like us. Otherwise, I'm afraid I would have died in some corner long ago." He reached out and patted Tang En's shoulder. "Sigh, after living for a lifetime, I finally understand that glory and loyalty are all empty. The most important thing is to live well with one's family. So, Arthur, you're still young. As long as you work hard, you will definitely, ugh." His arm stiffened, and Matthew obviously thought of what he had just seen and heard. With Tang En's current identity and status, he really didn't care about what he said. Of course, Tang En could also think of this and nodded. "Thank you for your teachings, Elder Ma." "Ugh, I don't deserve your teachings, I don't deserve." After coming back to his senses, Matthew frantically waved his hand and subconsciously shrank back to his previous cautious state. From his reaction, Tang En had a clear understanding of the hierarchy in the Northern Wilderness. There was no doubt that the disparity in status in the Northern Wilderness was much greater than in the Bran. Here, the strong were respected, and those with great power naturally had the power to kill ordinary people. So, there was no need to talk about the Bran here. Before Tang En could comfort him, the carriage suddenly shook and stopped. Then, a respectful voice came from outside. "Master, we've arrived at the craftsman's office." The door opened and a cold wind blew in. A somewhat honest young man bowed in the snow outside the carriage and waited. It was Matthew's coachman, who was also a Bran. In the Northern Wilderness, people like Matthew couldn't hire people from the Northern Wilderness, and even if they did, they wouldn't be at ease. Matthew had already stepped out of the carriage and extended his hand in an inviting gesture. Seeing this, Tang En could only touch his nose and smile bitterly. They were located at the north side of the palace castle, neither close nor far. From here, they could clearly see the towering city walls. The snow didn't stop falling, and the dozen guards in front of the iron gate not far away almost turned into snowmen. "Mr. Arthur, please follow me." With a shiver, Matthew tightened his cotton-padded jacket and walked forward in the direction of the iron gate. As for the carriage, it could only wait far away by the iron gate. Because of the importance of the Empress, the guards in the craftsman's office were still very strict. Those barbarian guards probably also knew Matthew and didn't care. But when they saw Tang En following behind, they immediately surrounded him. It wasn't a big problem, just a simple question. However, after hearing Tang En's name, the guards' expressions changed from their earlier carelessness to some solemnity. It was obvious that they had been notified before. And this scene undoubtedly made Matthew's eyes flash. He looked at Tang En as if he was looking at a prince who came to the company for an internship. In the stone house on the side of the iron gate, Tang En imitated Matthew and signed his name on a book. The moment he threw away the quill, even though Tang En had lived 2 lives, he couldn't help but sigh in his heart. Damn, I didn't expect that a third-rate student like me who couldn't find a job in the modern world would sign in here for the first time. Chapter 662. Although it looks quite messy here, in fact. Well, it's also very messy, but the area is actually divided into simple areas. For example, this is the place to study battlefield weapons. From weapons as big as Mjolnir to the weight of a mace, whether it's suitable for use, and so on, everything is studied here. Well, hey, why is there a sickle? Oh, some time ago they were studying farming tools here. It should not have been cleaned up. Don't worry about it. Well, the smell here is a bit strange because it's the place where poison is made. The security here is also the tightest. Arthur, you'd better not. Boom. Before he finished speaking, the tightly sealed buildings in front of him flashed, and immediately there was a small explosion. Then, black smoke came out from the cracks of the doors and windows, and there was a faint cough inside. Get closer. Look, as you can see. Go. Don't smell this. After walking into the craftsman's office, Tang En roughly toured all the areas inside under the dutiful guidance of Matthew. As for the feeling, how should he put it? Tang En felt that instead of saying that this was a pirated alchemy guild, it was better to say that it was a real noisy market. 1 word, messy. 2 words, very messy. 3 words, messy. Although he knew that this was the necessary preparation period, it was inevitable that it would be chaotic. But if the northern wilderness wanted to rely on this place to catch up with Brand's alchemy level, he was afraid that there was a long way to go. After walking around, Matthew patted his head, turned his head, and asked, "By the way, Arthur, why are you here?" "It's also for research." Tang En shrugged. "At present, there are only 2 things, or 2 kinds of lenses. As for the function, simply put, one can see clearly in front of you, and the other can see clearly in the distance. Lenses. Seeing clearly in front of you is understandable, but to see clearly in the distance. Is it the legendary magic mirror? You are a mage." Matthew's tone suddenly rose, and he exclaimed, "Of course not, these things are for ordinary people. In short, I can't explain it clearly in a short time. Let's talk about it later." Waving his hand, Tang En casually changed the topic. "Mr. Ma, you study metals. Which area do you work in?" "The battlefield equipment is there." Matthew pointed to the place that he introduced earlier and shook his head. "Actually, it's supposed to be a battlefield weapon, but after the armor and mace were made, the progress got stuck. That's why we switched to developing farming tools. However, Z's war god had destroyed several of the Thor's hammers on the outer walls when he broke into the Imperial City." You must have heard about this." After a pause, at the mention of Z, Matthew, who was once a member of the Bran, looked a little emotional. He then said, "Since the Mjolnir is broken, there is no need to worry as much as before." Therefore, they directly brought it here for research to see if it can be repaired. Actually, everyone knows that there's no hope for it to be repaired. Just treat it as learning something. At this point, Matthew spread out his hands with a helpless expression. That was the truth. Heavy weapons like Mjolnir were the key to Bran's victory against the Northern Baron territory. Bran had spent a tremendous amount of time and effort on them. Even a few generations of effort would be considered light. Therefore, it was naturally not something that the alchemy level of the northern wilderness could explore. But at this moment, there was a sudden burst of harsh laughter. Haha, at least you have some self-awareness. But since you can't fix it, what's the use of having you? It's better to pack up and leave as soon as possible. This is not a place to raise trash. Tangan turned his head in surprise when he heard the voice. He saw a thin old man in a green cotton robe, whose face was as pale as if he had been drunk by wine and women, walking over with a mocking smile on his face. Matthew, who was on the side, was furious when he saw this man. His body trembled slightly and he shouted, "Claude, you despicable man, it's not your turn to criticize me." Haha, it's not my turn now, but in a few days, I will be promoted to the area manager, and I will be in charge of you. Don't beg me at that time, because it's useless. I will watch you get out of here and become a frozen corpse on the roadside. Haha. The old man named Claude looked at Matthew and said arrogantly with a grating laugh like a rooster with its throat pinched. After a pause, Matthew's old face turned red. You think you can do whatever you want? Pfft, the director will not agree to let a shameless person like you become the area manager. Humph, then let's wait and see. Claude waved his hand disdainfully. He glanced at Tangun and narrowed his eyes. Newcomer? Haha, I advise you not to mix with this Matthew, or else. Ha! With a sinister laugh, he turned around and strode away. Tangun's expression didn't change. This level of threat couldn't arouse his reaction at all. He didn't even have the desire to teach the other party a lesson. But Matthew was obviously not like this. Although he spoke tough just now, he was now standing in the same place in a daze. His expression kept changing. Obviously, he was extremely worried. Tangun saw this and asked casually, "This Claude is also from the Bran, right? How did he have a grudge with you, Elder Ma?" This really made Tangun a little puzzled. At least in his opinion, the Bran people were still very united in this precarious foreign land. Only by huddling together like this could they have a little sense of security. Sigh, it's all trivial matters. Since I came in here and replaced his position in the battlefield, he has been jealous of me. Matthew shook his head helplessly. There is a limit to the number of people in each subject. I just came in, so I didn't know that I had replaced him, but he has always kept it in mind. After so many years, it has become like this. Oh, it seems that he's just a villain. He can't do much. Elder Ma, you don't have to worry too much. After all, Matthew had accompanied him for a long time. Tangun comforted him. Besides, didn't you just say that the director here will not agree with him doing this? Matthew sighed again. Sigh, Arthur, you just came here and don't understand the situation. I'm not worried about the director. Although he is from the northern wilderness because he is also obsessed with research, his attitude towards us Bran people is quite good. But the dozen deputy directors. Wait, a dozen? Well, they are basically a group of people who are here to gild their names. Through Matthew's worried introduction, Tangun finally understood what the superstructure of the Craftsmen's Institute looked like. First of all, the director was not a problem. After all, this was an institution valued by the Queen. Naturally, it was impossible to let an idiot manage it. But the dozen deputy directors were different. The Craftsmen's Institute was a place where it was very easy to produce results, and it was also a good place to gild their names. Therefore, some of the capable tribal chiefs tried to squeeze their direct descendants in. Even if they were only given the title of deputy chief with no real power, they would still get a share of the credit if there was any merit. And just now, although Clowen's alchemy level was average, he was very talented in flattery. With his lowly identity as a Bran, he was able to curry favor with a few ignorant and incompetent deputy directors. From this point of view, with the support of those deputy directors, it was very likely that Clowen would be promoted to the regional director. After all, it was just a middle-level director, and the director was naturally unlikely to brush off these deputy directors. And once Clowen really became the regional director, Matthew's result would naturally not be good. After all, it was always easy to find fault, especially when one was conscious. As long as he could find a reason to expel Matthew from here, the old and weak Matthew would most likely end up like what Cloran said, freezing to death on the side of the road. Of course, it was useless for Matthew to worry about this now. He had no background, so he could only wait and see. It didn't take long for Tang En to see the director of the Craftsmen's Institute that Matthew had just mentioned. He was a man with a strange smell and a majestic body in the northern wilderness. The other party was here to welcome him and take Tang En to his private laboratory. Obviously, Andre had already greeted him before. So even if the director was a little disapproving, he still had to do some superficial work for the sake of His Highness Lan Shah. After exchanging a few pleasantries with each other, the director simply proposed to go to Tang En's laboratory. Tang En naturally wouldn't object, but at this moment, "Director, I just happen to have some free time. Why don't you let me take Mr. Arthur to the laboratory?" Matthew, who had been staying next to him, suddenly said, "Also, I'm very interested in Mr. Arthur's research. Maybe I can help." The director was slightly startled when he heard the words. He glanced at Matthew and suddenly hesitated. To be honest, he really didn't have time to waste on Tang En. In his opinion, Tang En was undoubtedly a lucky man who climbed up the royal family's relationship. As for the research, at this age, don't joke around. Tang En turned his head and looked at Matthew, who was faintly pleading. His eyes flashed slightly, and he only pondered for a few seconds before nodding with a smile. "Haha, Elder Ma and I are already familiar with each other. It's naturally best for him to take me. What do you think, Director?" "Okay, then it's settled." Chapter 663. A relatively empty stone house, a simple test bench, some alchemy tools, and a few chairs. This was Tang En's laboratory. After casually fiddling with a few things that looked like test tubes and crystal bottles, Twain pulled over 2 chairs and smiled at Matthew, who was standing a little cramped at the side. "Haha, it's really simple. Mr. Matthew, please take a seat." "Thank you." Matthew, who had just been appointed as Tang En's assistant, sat on the chair and rubbed his hands. He looked at the surroundings and hesitated. "Actually, this is already considered good." Tang En couldn't help but raise his eyebrows. Although he had no substantial contact in the field of alchemy, don't forget that he bought alchemy equipment for Lena in Lion City. Any one of them cost at least a few thousand gold coins, and there was no discount. So, compared to the primitive equipment in front of him that was obviously not worth much money, it was not on the same level at all. Matthew seemed to have guessed Tang En's thoughts and shook his head helplessly. "The conditions here are incomparable to Bran's. It's not easy to have a personal laboratory here." After a pause, he glanced at Tang En. Matthew couldn't help but be more certain of his previous choice. He then continued, "But fortunately, as long as your level is high enough, the materials here can be used at will." Well, with Arthur's level, there shouldn't be a problem, right? This was considered a test of Tang En's approximate position in the craftsman's office to judge whether his choice was right or wrong. After all, the previous royal guards, His Highness carriage, and so on represented great significance, but they were too far away from here. As the saying goes, a county official is not as good as a local official. However, it was obvious that Matthew's cautious test was destined to be useless because Tang En was thrown here by Lan Sha. For a while, he didn't know how much authority he had. He honestly spread his hands and said, "I don't know if there's a problem. Well, is the level of the transparent crystal high? I need that." Matthew was taken aback when he heard this. He then patted his head, realizing that he had asked a stupid question. It was obvious that this was the young man's first time in the smithy, so how could he know the level of the smithy? Then, he suppressed the faint regret in his heart and replied, "Transparent crystal? Oh, it's a crystal ore, right? No problem, I can get it now." "Ha, that's naturally for the best. Elder Ma, you've also studied ores? It can't be considered research. I just came into contact with it a lot." Matthew smiled bitterly. There are too few people in the northern wilderness who know about alchemy, so people from different research subjects often transfer their help. Take me for example. I might only be a metal alchemist, but after all these years, I can already concoct some simple potions. Tang En couldn't help but laugh as he shook his head. Then, he told them his requirements for the crystal ores he needed. It was very simple, the purer, the better. Seeing Matthew nodding and leaving, Tang En's eyes flickered. Of course, he knew Matthew's purpose, but he didn't care. He needed a helper, and the other party needed his protection. Both sides took what they needed. It was fair. After these thoughts flashed through his mind, Tang En frowned and thought about how to detoxify the unknown poison in his body. These days, Tang En wasn't completely in a comfortable state of eating and drinking. After secretly observing, he found that the degree of surveillance around him was actually very low. Other than the 100 guards at the stone building, there was no one else monitoring him. Of course, this wasn't caused by Lan Sha's carelessness. It only showed that she was very confident in the poison in Tang En's body. In fact, this was the case. With Tang En's current abnormal physique, although he wasn't invulnerable to poison, he had never seen a poison that could trap him before. But now, this poison was quietly waiting in his meridians and bones like maggot. No matter how much blood Qi washed over it, it still remained unmoved and was extremely tenacious. But fortunately, this poison should be a slow-acting poison. It hadn't broken out even once in so many days. And since Lan Sha didn't show up after entering the city, this poison wouldn't kill him in a short period of time. Thinking of this, Tang En touched his chin and muttered, "TSK, it seems that I have to find a way to meet that girl first. I don't expect to get the antidote, but at least I have to get some information. But before that..." He looked up at the place where the small explosion had occurred. "That's the place where the poison is made. There should be some information about this." Not long after, Matthew brought a large pile of accompanying crystals, and a few black-robed apprentices moved them into the laboratory. Most of these apprentices were northern wilderness children in their teens. Unlike the ordinary barbarians who weren't very smart, they were quite smart. Everyone could speak the Bran language. Although it was a little stiff, it was obvious that they had been specially trained. From this, one could see the ambition of the northern wilderness empress. Although the apprentices could only be assistants now, after a few decades, when Matthew and the other alchemists from Bulan grew old, the craftsman's workshop would be taken over by the northern Baron people who had grown up and were pure northern Baron people. Of course, this had nothing to do with Tang En. When he thought of the northern wilderness empress, other than a little admiration, he was full of criticism. F***ck, if the upper beam isn't straight, the lower beam will be crooked too. The older one was shameless and had a bad character. The younger one, Lan Sha, was very cunning. And that one called Tiu, Tang En remembered. Wasn't he the crazy general who had once besieged him? In short, there was no good person in this family. As Tang En continued to criticize in his heart, He observed these crystal ores that were either complete or broken, and the corners of his mouth could not help but gradually rise. The situation was much better than he expected. He didn't know if it was because of the influence of the environment in this different world, but the crystal mines here were naturally very pure. Some of them didn't even have the slightest impurity, so there was no need for secondary processing. It seems that only the concave lens needs to be polished. Well, polishing is a problem, but relying on blood gas, it should be able to remove the surface burrs to the greatest extent. There's also the lens power. Oh, I forgot to ask that girl how much myopia she has. Forget it, she won't know even if I ask her. I'll just make a few more pairs of glasses. The biggest problem now is the focal length. How do I calculate the formula? Damn, isn't this making things difficult for a third-rate student like me? But I should be able to get a model with the system analysis. I just need to keep correcting it in the real world. Squatting next to the crystal mine, Tang kept muttering like a neurotic, which made Matthew and the other apprentices dumbfounded. They were also confused. Polishing? Focal length? Focal length. What the F***ck is this? Clap, clap. Tang patted his hands and found that the problem wasn't too big. He stood up with satisfaction, shook his head, and sighed. It's too backward. If there were optical lenses, everything would be solved. Arthur, optical lenses, what is that? Matthew first asked weakly, then patted his chest and promised. Describe the appearance, and I'll send someone to find it for you. Tang was stunned, then he laughed and waved his hand. Haha, forget it, Elder Ma. It's really hard to find this thing in the northern wilderness. It's fine as long as there's something that can replace it. Oh, then tell me, what should we do? Tang chuckled. He knew that Matthew was eager to get closer to him, but he didn't point it out. Instead, he gestured politely and said, Then I'll have to trouble you, Elder Ma. Well, pick out some crystal mines first. Only the purest, without a trace of impurity. Then, cut them into small pieces, each of them about this size. Soon, the instructions were given. Although Matthew and the apprentices didn't know the meaning of Tang's actions, they still cooperated with him. Originally, Tang thought that it would be very difficult for Matthew and the others to do this work. After all, crystal ores were also very hard. For ordinary people, if they didn't use violent means and directly smash them, it would be a test of patience. But in fact, after Matthew and the others found a few transparent knives, they easily pierced the crystal ores and slowly cut them. Excluding the net-like fine lines caused by the uneven use of force, the success rate was about 50-50. Soon, the prototype of a round lens was made. After asking, Tang learned that the transparent knife was called a mining knife. It was an alchemy item, and its function was to cut most common ores as much as possible without damaging them. Of course, from the name, it could be seen that it was an exclusive tool. If it was used as a weapon, it would be easily broken. Tang saw that he didn't need his help at all. After greeting Matthew, he walked out of the laboratory, looked around, and openly walked to the place where the poison was concocted. Chapter 664. In front of the poison-making area. Stop. Who are you? You're not allowed to enter here. Call the director. Tell him that I'm Arthur. But, go! He stood there casually, glanced at them, and shouted in a low voice. His voice was not loud, but it was enough to make people feel a faint anger and an irresistible power. This was not the suppression of strength, but the unique sense of dignity of a superior. Under such pressure, the two barbarian guards looked at each other, and the corners of their mouths twitched. It seemed that they wanted to confirm the identity of the visitor, but they did not have the courage to do so. One of them simply saluted, and then hurriedly ran back. Sure enough, he was here. Tang put his hands behind his back, and a faint smile appeared on his dignified face. When he had met the director before, He had smelled a strange smell on his body, which was emitted from the poison-making area. Now, judging from the reaction of the guards, the director had returned here after meeting him. In this way, he did not need to think of a way to sneak in. As for the dignified manner he maintained now, it was just a simple disguise technique. For the current Twain, it was completely at his fingertips and was not worth mentioning. About 5 minutes later, the guard who had just gone in to report, and the director who looked a little angry, rushed in. It seemed that an important experiment had been interrupted. "Haha, the director is really here. It took me a long time to find you." The dignified look disappeared in an instant, and Tangen stepped over the guard with a bright smile on his face, and greeted him. "What are you doing here?" The director could not help but stare blankly. He did not understand the situation. Then Tangen grabbed his arm, shook it, and said, "I've heard that the director is proficient in making poisons. I'm also very interested in this. I wonder if you can take me in to have a look. Well, the thing I'm researching now is related to this. Maybe I can use it to get some inspiration." Of course, this was nonsense. Lenses, poisons, and even pharmaceutics had nothing to do with each other. However, Tang En was certain that Lan Sha would not tell outsiders what he was making. After all, eyeglasses didn't matter, but binoculars, which seemed inconspicuous, could affect the course of a battle under certain circumstances. Especially in this era of cold weapon warfare, it was naturally better for fewer people to know about it before it was developed. Sure enough, after the director heard the latter half of the sentence, he couldn't help but hesitate. He really didn't know what Tang En was researching, but he knew that it was for His Highness Lan Sha. In that case, it would be difficult to directly reject the other party. At this time, Tang En took advantage of the director's hesitation to wave his hand to the guard at the side and said, "Okay, go do your own thing." Then, he dragged the director's body and walked inside. He really didn't treat himself as an outsider. The director's face couldn't help but turn black when he saw this, but he was also somewhat helpless. He knew that it was impossible to get rid of this guy in a short time. He broke free from his arm and forced a smile. "Well, since Mr. Arthur is so interested, then I will show you around. And which series of poisons are you interested in?" "Which series? I'm really a layman when it comes to this. Why don't you show me around, director?" Casually speaking, Tang En promised with a harmless face, "Don't worry, I will definitely not interfere with everyone's normal experimental work. After all, poisons sound very dangerous. Didn't it explode just now? Oh haha, I'm not afraid." "Humph, cowardly and hypocritical Bran." The director listened to the laughter that was trying to cover up and couldn't help but curl his lips in disdain. His expression relaxed, and the trace of suspicion in his heart dissipated. After walking into the tightly sealed building inside, a long corridor appeared in front of him. Most of the wooden doors could be seen every few meters on both sides. It looked a bit like the layout of a hotel. "This is the room for the research of poisons of the plant series. This is the ore series. This is the natural miasma. Sorry, I can't show you one by one. As you said just now, it's very dangerous here. Any trace of gas that leaks out is likely to contain fatal toxins." "Gudong. So dangerous?" "Oh, it's okay, director doesn't need to apologize. In fact, I'm just here to broaden my horizons. And what's inside?" There seems to be a sound. Swallowing his saliva, Tang En continued to maintain a strong appearance. He looked around and asked questions from time to time, looking very curious. "Oh, it's the magical beast series. This sound." Listening to the dying roar from inside, the director had a faint smile on his face. It should be dissecting a magical beast. You know, some magical beasts have poison glands in their stomach. It needs to be dissected to find it. And, Mr. Arthur, do you want to go in and take a look? Let's forget about it. In fact, I'm not very interested in magical beast series poisons." "Oh, I knew it would be like this. The director secretly despised Tang En in his heart, but on the surface, he still smiled. In that case, let's go in and take a look. Okay, let's go, let's go. The place to study poisons was not small. The two walked and stopped, strolling for more than 10 minutes before entering the last building. Of course, all the space here was not for studying poisons. Other devices and equipment similar to dealing with unexpected situations also took up some space, or even most of it. After all, poisons were indeed difficult to predict. This was the imperial city of the northern wilderness. If some kind of virus like the plague was created and accidentally spread, it would be a big problem. Seeing the wall at the end, the director stopped, turned halfway and spread out his hands. This is all the places here. I wonder if Mr. Arthur has any inspiration? Haha, I do have some ideas. Answering casually, Tang En's eyes quickly swept over. His eyebrows suddenly raised, and he pointed to a room not far away on his left and asked, "What's in there?" The director looked in the direction of his finger. "Oh, that's the record room. It collects some of the poisons and antidotes that have been studied. There's nothing to see." "Haha, this is the place I'm looking for." Tang En was delighted when he heard this. He quickly walked over and said, I like to look at this kind of thing. It's satisfying and not dangerous." The director frowned when he saw this. This kind of research results that were hard to come by naturally could not be casually shown to outsiders. He immediately reached out to grab Tang En's arm. "Mr. Arthur, you can't." The seemingly sure grab only brushed his clothes, but he caught nothing. While he was stunned, Tang En had already arrived at the door. The director did not think too much about it because he knew that the door must be locked, and only he had the key. He walked over, shook his head and said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Arthur. Without orders from the higher-ups I can't open it." While he was stunned, the director saw Tang En just push the door, creak, and go in so easily. He quickly came back to his senses, and his expression could not help but be very ugly and mixed with a faint doubt. "Damn it! Did I forget to lock the door the last time I came in?" The shocked and angry director did not see that when Tang En pushed the door open, there was an almost imperceptible flash of a blade in his hand. It had to be said that it was undoubtedly naive to think that a wooden door could stop an assassin. The space inside the door was not big, and there were only a few iron bookshelves. Besides the side near the door, most of the bookshelves were empty. This was a normal situation. After all, it was extremely difficult to completely control something like poison. In just a few seconds, when the director came to the door, he saw Tang En casually flipping through the book. Whoosh whoosh. His speed was extremely fast, and in less than a breath's time, he put the books back in their original places. He looked very bored and muttered to himself, "What is this? I thought it was in the form of a legendary novel. I didn't expect it to be all inexplicable symbols and patterns." The northern wilderness was vigorously popularizing the Bran culture. A considerable number of the books here were also recorded in the Bran language, so there was naturally no problem of not being able to understand them. But looking at the speed at which Tang En was flipping through the books, there was no doubt that he could not see anything, and it was impossible for him to remember anything. Seeing this, the director could not help but breathe a sigh of relief. His expression relaxed a little, and he said, "I said there is nothing to see here, but you didn't believe me. Mr. Arthur, since you have seen all the places, I will send you out." "Wait, I don't believe that there's nothing here that I can read." After throwing the last book back on the bookshelf, Tang En looked a little dejected as he walked to the door. "There is really nothing here. Sigh, forget it, it's boring. Let's go back." "Haha, okay." The director glanced at the bookshelf and made sure that there was not a single book missing. He laughed twice and solemnly locked the door. At this time, Tang En picked his ears and grinned, like a fox that had jumped into a chicken coop. Unfortunately, the director, who had his back to the door, did not see it in his mind. Only Tang En could hear the system's synthetic voice constantly ringing. Ding, recording of 99 types of plant poison completed. Ding. Recording of snake-type magical beast poison formula complete. Ding. Ding. Ding, ding, recording of unknown language book completed. Host, please provide complete information of the language as soon as possible. Chapter 665. We, the people, are so happy today, so happy. Tang En narrowed his slender eyes and hummed a strange tune as he strolled back to the laboratory. Hearing this voice, Matthew, who was dividing the ore, turned around in surprise. Hey, Arthur, you went out for a walk and you seem to be in a good mood. Tang En patted the snowflakes that fell on his body and laughed. Haha, of course. In just a few breaths, the poison formulas that the craftsmen had painstakingly developed for more than 10 years were all taken out. Anyone would have a reason to be happy. And Tang En really did not believe that he could not find the poison in his body with so many formulas. Of course, Matthew could not understand why Tang En was so happy just by going out for a walk. He pointed to the dissected lens prototypes piled on the side. Arthur, see if these meet your requirements. After a pause, he helplessly spread out his hands. What you need is without the slightest impurity. This is a bit difficult, and I can only get this much for the time being. But tomorrow is the day to replenish the materials in the warehouse, and there should be a batch of accompanying crystal ores sent over. I'll get it for you then. Haha, okay, then I'll leave everything to you. Of course, of course. This batch of crystal ores had been dug out beyond recognition, like a beehive. Immediately after, Matthew instructed the few apprentices to continue looking for a place where he could use the knife. After greeting Twain, he went out and walked to the place where the materials were stored. He wanted to book the crystal ores that would arrive tomorrow in order to avoid any mistake. Tang En looked at Matthew, who was unusually enthusiastic, even more enthusiastic than himself. He could not help but shake his head and chuckle. Without thinking much, he pulled a chair to sit down and closed his eyes to rest. In the next moment, Tang En's figure appeared in the system space. It was a cold climate with heavy snow outside, but here it was a sparse dense forest with bright sunshine. It was really amazing. But now Tang En did not care about this at all. As soon as he landed on the ground, he immediately shouted, "How is it, old butler, is the poison in my body recorded in the book just now?" Unfortunately, at the moment, there isn't. The old butler, who was lying on a hammock between two big trees, said in a leisurely tone, "Don't worry, it's not a big deal." Nanny? Tang En panicked. It can't be. This should be the most complete poison formula in the northern wilderness. Look carefully. I also got the same result. Do you think the system would make such a low-level mistake? Besides, the old butler waved his hand to disperse the hammock and landed on the ground. This is just the result of the current analysis. Don't forget that some of the books you scanned were recorded in the northern wilderness language. The system doesn't have complete information on the language, so it can't recognize it for now. Damn, why didn't you say so earlier? Tang En could not help but feel a little relieved when he heard this. It would be too depressing if his previous act was useless in the end. Fortunately, there was still some hope now. He frowned and thought, the northern wilderness language, the northern wilderness is now popularizing the brand culture. There must be similar translated books, so it shouldn't be too difficult to find. Forget it, this is not urgent. Let's put it aside for now. After making up his mind, Tang En looked up again and asked, "Old butler, can the system create a model of the glasses?" "Yes, the short-sighted kind. The system already has very complete information on the modern world. It's just that there's a problem with you. Now that you're in the other world, the information is seriously lacking." After a brief explanation, the old butler said calmly, "It's just a pair of glasses, of course there's no problem. But this is just a parametric model. You still need to find the materials in the real world and complete it yourself." Of course. Wait, there's information on the modern world? That's right. The old butler nodded lightly. If you're in the modern world, as long as you don't die, then you should be an assassin proficient in all kinds of firearms, close combat, and driving most vehicles. But in the other world, the system's understanding of the battle energy, magic system, and so on is basically zero. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. You can only choose to be proficient in cold weapons. Fortunately, there's still blood, so you didn't suffer any losses. If that's the case. Tang En's expression was strange as he said slowly, if I want to build an atomic bomb, of course you can, there's all the information. The old butler nodded straightforwardly. Then, the old butler calmly counted with his fingers. But first, you need to reach a certain level before you have the authority to access the required information. Then, you need to build a complete nuclear industry foundation. Without this, there won't be nuclear combustion, let alone nuclear weapons. It's worth mentioning that even from a purely theoretical point of view, this involves many disciplines such as physics and chemistry. Then, even if you have nuclear fuel... Stop! Tang En, whose eyes were spinning, quickly made a pause gesture and wiped the cold sweat off his forehead. Don't say anything else. I think it's more suitable for a third-rate academic like me to make glasses. This was the so-called entering a mountain of treasures only to return empty-handed. Although there were all kinds of awesome technologies, just the difference in the environment of the two worlds was enough to kill most of the inventions before they were born. Small things like washing machines and glasses were still okay. After all, the structure was not complicated. Even if he could not find the raw materials, he could use alchemy materials similar to those in the other world. It was not a big deal. But if it involved the microscopic level, what could be used to replace nuclear elements? Moreover, ask yourself honestly, even if you were to replace them, would you dare to use them? Thinking of this, Tang En could not help but look up and sigh. The fantasy of using airplanes and atomic bombs to blow up all the masters on the mainland was completely annihilated. He shook his head and instantly cleared these messy thoughts. He reached out and called up the system's light screen, showing the lens parameter models of 100 degrees, 200 degrees, 300 degrees, and so on. Fortunately, glasses were only a small thing, and Tang En's level was high enough. Otherwise, he could only scratch his head and slowly polish the lenses that were suitable for Lan Sha. And even if the model was already there, Tang En's great undertaking of making glasses was only a good start. Now, the problem he needed to solve was, how could he polish the lenses in the real world to be exactly the same as the model? There was no other way. He could only use pieces of lens prototypes to accumulate the feeling of touch, form a physical memory, and finally succeed in one try. Fortunately, everything could be changed in the space. Otherwise, the lens prototypes made by Matthew and the others might not be enough for Tang En to practice with. Then let's start. With a roar, Tang En sat on the ground and rubbed his hands. He stretched out his hand to summon the dagger and lens prototypes and lowered his head to carefully polish them, of course, in the real world. Matthew and the apprentices looked at Tang En, who seemed to have fallen asleep on the chair. They looked at each other and couldn't help but be speechless. What kind of person is this, slacking off on the first day of work, in the evening, at the entrance of the craftsman's office? The snowflakes were still slowly falling, quietly dyeing the sky and earth pure white. However, in terms of momentum, it was a little weaker than it was in the morning. The black canopied carriage that they had come in picked up their master and began to set foot on the road back. In the silent carriage, the sound of clop clop clop. It was either fast or slow, but the sound did not stop. This was not the sound of horse hooves coming from the outside, but the tapping sound made by Tang En's palms and fingers that were placed on the inner wall of the carriage. It was as if they were constantly shaking like epilepsy. It couldn't be helped. For most of the day, This kind of micromanipulation had already formed a sequela. Oh no, it was a physical memory. Of course, Tang En could suppress it, but in order not to destroy this feeling, in the end, he let the 5 fingers continue to act wildly. Matthew on the opposite side looked for a while before hesitantly asking, "Arthur, your fingers, are they okay?" "Oh, they're fine." Tang En casually waved his left hand and asked, "Elder Ma, you've lived in the northern wilderness for so many years, so you must know the language here, right?" Matthew nodded. "Yes, as long as it's not too rare or too fast." "Haha, Arthur, you know, the people in the northern wilderness speak like there's a date pit in their mouth. It's very vague. I've been here for more than 10 years before I slowly adapted." "Haha, that's true. Well, Elder Ma, do you know where I can learn the barbarian language systematically?" Tang En smiled gently. "No matter what, it's a fact that I'm in the northern wilderness now, so I have to learn to avoid being scolded in the future." "Haha, Arthur, your motivation for learning is interesting." He laughed and shook his head, stroked his beard, and said, "The northern wilderness has been promoting the brand culture for years. For example, the apprentices in the Craftsman's Institute can now communicate with us normally in the brand language. Well, I remember that they used a translated book when they first started learning. There are a lot of brand words in it." After a pause, he continued, "Arthur, if you want to master the northern wilderness language as soon as possible, I suggest you find these books to study and then read a lot of northern wilderness books. This will be much faster." Tang En nodded. "Thank you, Elder Ma, I'll try this method. However, I'm new here, so where can I get a lot of books?" "Well, is there a bookstore here?" "Bookstore? How is that possible?" Matthew immediately shook his head. "Don't be fooled by the people in the northern wilderness who are usually very rude, but most people are still very respectful to knowledgeable people. Knowledge is almost priceless here, and there are very few books for sale in the market." "I see." Tang En couldn't help but frown when he heard this. He really didn't expect this to happen. At this time, Matthew waved his hand. "But Arthur, you don't have to worry about this problem. The largest library in the Imperial City is in the Palace Castle. With your relationship," Tang En raised his eyebrows and looked at Matthew, who was nervously watching his expression. He smiled and nodded. "Then there's no problem. Thank you, Elder Ma, for your guidance." "Haha, it's nothing." Matthew's face lit up, and his heart finally settled. He thought to himself, "It seems that this Arthur does have a deep relationship with the royal family. My risky choice was right. Next, as long as I have a good relationship with him, even if Clorin is promoted to the regent's person in charge, he won't dare to touch me." The two looked at each other and smiled. Everything was understood without words. However, at this time, suddenly, hiss, the old horse's neigh was mixed with the slightly anxious sound of the coachman taming the horse. Then, the carriage suddenly shook, and it should have suddenly slowed down. Matthew, who was sitting on the outside, exclaimed and immediately fell inwards. Fortunately, Tang En reached out and stopped him in time. Otherwise, it would have been difficult for him to escape the disaster. The next moment, there was a vague roar of reprimand coming from outside the carriage. Chapter 666. Olaguna. The roar echoed inside and outside the carriage. Tang En frowned. He supported Matthew with one hand and opened the curtain with the other. "What do you mean?" "Go away, cough cough." Matthew hurriedly shook his head when he saw Tang En frowning. "It means go away." Outside the window, the trembling carriage gradually stabilized. However, it had completely deviated from the wide road and came to a stone house on the side of the street. Looking at the exaggerated sickle-shaped wheel marks behind it, it was clear that the carriage had almost hit the stone house. Because of the angle, Tang En's side of the window was a stone wall, so he only heard the roar and did not see anything unexpected. Matthew got up awkwardly from Tang En's arm. His face was full of anger. He opened the small window in front of the carriage and let the cold wind in. Outside, he saw the back of the coachman who was trying his best to pull the reins. "Damn it, what did you do?" "Master, huff. Look in front." With a few long neigh from the old horse, the carriage finally stopped after rubbing against the stone wall for more than 10 meters. Matthew seemed to have seen something through the small window. His body shook violently and he stood there without moving. Tang En opened the curtain on the other side and finally found something unusual. Not far away, on the wide road piled with thick snow, more than a dozen knights in black armor whistled past. The barbarian roars were constantly coming out of their mouth. It seemed that they were opening the road. It was evening now. Although there were not many people and carriages on the road, there were still some. However, these knights did not seem to have seen it. They directly urged their horses to open the road. If someone was too slow to dodge, they would be whipped and rolled to the side of the road. For a moment, there were screams outside the carriage. The people and carriages on the road seemed to have been split by a sharp sword and quickly dodged to the sides. After an ordinary carriage rushed out of the road, it stumbled. Although the coachman was trying his best to control the reins, the carriage still inevitably hit the stone wall on the side of the road. Boom! Broken wood flew everywhere. More than half of the carriage immediately overturned, and high-pitched screams could be faintly heard from the carriage. "Ha ha!" The dozen or so cavalrymen laughed when they saw this. However, they did not delay and continued to charge forward. Soon after, the sound of footsteps that could be considered uniform could be heard faintly shaking the carriage. Large groups of barbarian soldiers wearing complete animal skins were reflected on the carriage's windows. Their silhouettes swayed, and their imposing manner was extraordinary. Mad Eagle Tribe. As soon as Matthew's trembling voice sounded, Tang En saw a luxurious carriage appear in his field of vision behind the soldiers. 4 handsome black horses led the way, and a dark red flag with golden edges fluttered in the wind above the carriage. The flag was embroidered with an eagle with its head held high and its wings spread out. The flag fluttered. Amidst the snowflakes that filled the sky, the eagle seemed to want to break out of the flag. It let out a sharp cry as it soared into the sky. No wonder they dared to be so arrogant in the imperial city. So they're from the Wild Eagle Tribe. Wild Eagle Tribe? Tang En raised his eyebrows in surprise. He could not help but think of the Falcon Skyriders, Lancelot, and the rest that he had seen in Bran. Matthew misunderstood Tang En's meaning, and only took it as a question. He explained, "Yes, this is the Wild Eagle Tribe that is second only to the Sirius royal family in the northern wilderness. They are as famous as the Warlion and Invisible Snake tribes. The way the people of this tribe do things is just like their tribe's name. Mad. Domineering. Arrogant." After saying 3 adjectives in a row, Matthew shook his head. Therefore, almost no one in the northern wilderness dares to provoke the people of the Wild Eagle Tribe. This is because once they go crazy, they may not care about the tribe's interests and just want to have a good time. At this point, he patted his chest with some lingering fear. Fortunately, our carriage managed to avoid them in time. Otherwise, the consequences would be unimaginable. This was what it meant to be fearless and fearless. Tang En nodded in understanding. He narrowed his eyes and looked out of the window. The luxurious carriage was gradually moving away under the escort of hundreds of barbarian soldiers. Matthew seemed to have thought of something and his expression changed. He turned to Tang En and said, "Arthur, it's best that we don't go out recently." "Yes, I just thought of something. Not long ago, some people of the Warlion tribe suddenly betrayed us and attacked the palace castle when everyone was caught off guard. In the end, of course, the Empress calmed them down. The Warlion tribe also suffered a great loss because of this." He took a deep breath. "So, if I'm not wrong, the people of the Wild Eagle Tribe entered the city in a high-profile manner to fight for the interests that the Warlion tribe abandoned. Moreover, the invisible snake tribe and the others probably won't let go of this opportunity. They should be on their way here now. Sigh, I'm afraid the palace is not peaceful recently. We have to be more careful. One had to admit that Matthew's analysis was very reasonable. Tang Yen nodded in agreement. These battles had nothing to do with him. Moreover, he did not want to cause trouble and affect his escape plan. After this small episode, the carriage moved forward again. Because he was afraid that they would be unlucky enough to run into people from other tribes again, Matthew deliberately asked the coachman to slow down to give them time to react. But this time, no accidents happened. The carriage smoothly arrived in front of Tang Yen's house. After greeting and thanking him, Tang Yen stepped out of the carriage. Matthew lifted the curtain and looked at the majestic martial stone building and the surrounding imperial guards. He could not help but reveal a look of envy. A brand could actually do this in the northern wilderness. It was really incredible. Tang Yen, of course, did not know about Matthew's feelings. At this time, he waved his hand to call the head of the guards and said, "Go back and tell Andre that I invite His Highness Lan Shah to the craftsman's office tomorrow." "Okay, what's the specific time?" "As long as it's during my working hours, I won't wait for anything else." After throwing down these words, Tang Yen swaggered through the iron gate and thought to himself, "It seems that the matter of the library will fall on the girl. Well, if I can directly get the information about the poison tomorrow, that would be the best." But before that, looking down at his trembling right hand, Tang Yen could not help but smile bitterly. The feeling was still there. It seemed that he would have to practice overnight tonight. Damn, the evil overtime system. The night passed without words. The next morning, without waiting for Tang Yen to wake up, Matthew had already arrived outside the house early in the morning to wait for him. Tang Yen had no choice but to eat something. Then, he still sat in Matthew's ordinary black carriage and drove to the craftsman's office. On the way, Matthew worriedly said that in the second half of last night, there were indeed many people from large tribes who came to the imperial city. Among them was the hidden snake tribe, which was as famous as the berserk eagle tribe. Tang Yen was not interested in this news, but he was a little surprised by Matthew's well-informed source. After asking directly, Tang Yen learned that the number of brand people in the imperial city of the northern wilderness was not small. Because they were all in different places, these brand people were also unusually united. Any news or job opportunities, etc., would be circulated internally for the first time. Over time, a relatively stable circle of communication was formed. Of course, a top-notch person like Claude was not included in this list. Matthew also took the opportunity to invite Tang Yen to participate in the gathering of this circle, but he was politely refused by Tang Yen. It was not that he looked down on these people, but Tang Yen would run away sooner or later. So once the matter was exposed, it would only harm these people who didn't know him. After arriving at the craftsman's office, the two separated. Tang Yen's direction was the laboratory. He was ready to take advantage of the enthusiasm to get the lens out in one go. Matthew was going to the material warehouse to guard the batch of crystal ores that would arrive today. When he came to the laboratory that belonged to him alone, Tang Yen was surprised to find that there were already a few apprentices who were one step ahead of him and were cleaning up the room. Tang Yen secretly nodded and couldn't help but show a faint appreciation. If an apprentice wanted to enter the craftsman's office, the only criterion was to see if they were smart enough. Therefore, not all the apprentices here came from influential families. There were a lot of people who were actually from very ordinary backgrounds, and some were even poor. The latter knew that this was an opportunity that could change their fate, so they would work harder for it. Whether it was the Bran or the northern wilderness, people who worked hard were often more likable, right? With this thought in mind, Tang Yen smiled in response to the apprentice's salutes. He walked to the pile of lens prototypes, picked up a piece, and tossed it in the air. Without needing to observe and study, Tang Yen already knew the size, weight, and suitable lens for the lens prototype. There was no need to be surprised, because in the system space, Tang En was about to vomit from looking at these lens prototypes. Tossing it up again, a transparent knife suddenly appeared in Tang En's hand. It was the alchemy gold knife. Then, when the lens prototype reached the top and was about to fall, his long and narrow eyes suddenly narrowed. His arm disappeared, and phantom blades burst out like snowflakes. Hiss! Chapter 667. At this time, in the warehouse of the craftsman. What did you say? Say it again. The crystal mine was taken away? Shouting, Matthew's face turned red. He didn't know where he got the courage from, but he grabbed the collar of the northern wasteland man who was in charge of the warehouse. His beard trembled, and his saliva flew everywhere. Damn! What did I say yesterday? It was clearly reserved. How could you let someone else take it away? You motherf***er. The man from the northern wilderness was completely dumbfounded by the series of roars. He looked at Matthew, who used to be humble and respectful to him, who suddenly went berserk. The man from the northern wilderness didn't come back to his senses for a while. What's going on? The man from the northern wilderness didn't know that Matthew was angry, but he had reason to be angry. Yesterday, Matthew had already inquired that Clorin's promotion to the person in charge of the area was indeed a matter of fact. So from yesterday until now, Matthew's attitude towards Tang En's experiment was very positive. He wanted nothing more than to show his value as much as possible so that he could get Tang En's protection. But now, if he couldn't even get the experimental materials that he promised in advance, what would Tang En think? Would he still help him? The more he thought about it, the angrier he got. Matthew couldn't wait to eat the man from the northern wilderness alive. Of course, before that, he still needed to get an answer. He reluctantly suppressed his anger and asked angrily, "What about the crystal, or, who took it away?" The man who was in the wrong was completely suppressed by the old man from the brand, and he subconsciously replied, it's me." A complacent tone came from his side. Matthew turned his head and saw Clorin walking in from the door. He was tidying up his collar and said unhurriedly, "It's a pity. I happen to need a large number of crystal ores for my experiment. You see, it's such a coincidence. But who told me to be here before you? Of course, this couldn't be a coincidence. It wasn't time for the craftsman to start work yet, but Claude appeared here early and took away the newly arrived crystal ores. Anyone could see that he was obviously targeting them. Matthew was so angry that he was trembling all over. He knew that he would never be able to get the crystal ores back. With a howl, he waved his fists and pounced on Zhang Tai. "You old dog!" Looking at Matthew's angry and anxious expression, Claude, who was laughing happily, did not expect the other party to suddenly go berserk. His left eye was instantly hit by the fist, and he could not help but let out a scream. This matter was related to Matthew's life and death. Naturally, it was impossible to let Clorin go easily. Seeing that the first attack was effective, Clorin hurriedly punched again. Clorin finally recovered after taking a few punches. He immediately roared angrily and counterattacked. After the burly man from the northern wilderness came back to his senses, he saw Matthew and Claude, the two old brand men, lying on the ground, their hands and feet tangled together and covered in dust. They rolled over and over, and it was unknown whether it was their beard or their hair, but from time to time curses and screams could be heard. Why are you fighting? After all, Matthew and Claude were the most important alchemists in the northern wilderness. That burly barbarian naturally couldn't let the two of them fight, at least not in his territory. He scratched his head and promptly stepped forward to persuade them. "Okay, stop fighting, you are already so old." "Ouch! I said stop fighting, or you can go outside and fight." Matthew and Claude had been fighting for more than a decade, and with the new enmity and old hatred, it was naturally impossible to persuade them to stop. That burly barbarian rashly went over, but not only did he fail to pull the two apart, he was instead scratched a few times in the scuffle, and a few bloodstains appeared on his cheek. This angered the burly barbarian, and he directly grabbed the back of the collars of the two men, opened his hands, and instantly separated the two men in the air. No matter what, Matthew and Claude were just two old men, and their fighting strength was naturally not that high. The scuffle just now seemed fierce, but it was actually just like a child's random punches. As a result, they were naturally no match for the burly barbarian. Heaving a sigh of relief, the burly barbarian persuaded in a somewhat clumsy Bran language, "That's enough, it's just a batch of crystal ores, is there a need to be like this?" Matthew, whose hair was in a mess, reacted fiercely, "Why not? Claude, you old dog, if you don't hand over that batch of crystal ores today, I won't forgive you." "Won't forgive me? Ha ha." Because he was in a passive position at first, Claude suffered a lot, and now he wanted to laugh, but he couldn't help hissing because of the black corners of his mouth. "Matthew, ha ha. Let me tell you, when I become the person in charge of this area, you will be dead, ha ha ha, dead. All right, let's not talk too much. If I die, you won't be able to live either." As soon as he finished speaking, Matthew's old arms and legs suddenly exerted strength from his waist and abdomen and kicked Claude. "Ah, die, ha ha. Go and die now, come on, I said enough. I'll beat you to death." After a chaotic battle, the burly barbarian couldn't stand it anymore and directly carried the two out of the door like chickens and handed them over to the director. When the director heard this, he couldn't help but have a headache. After persuading them for a while, he saw that there was no effect, so he simply ordered the burly barbarian to take Claude out and separate the two to calm down. After about 10 minutes, Matthew left the director's place in a daze. Now that he had gradually regained his rationality, he knew that it was impossible to get that batch of crystal ores back. Then he thought about the consequences of leaving the craftsman's office without Tangen's protection. He let out a long sigh. Sigh. Damn old dog. Matthew grumbled and cursed. He wiped the blood from his chin that had seeped out due to his beard being pulled out. He then walked back to Tangen's laboratory dejectedly. A few minutes later, Matthew came to the door of the laboratory. After hesitating for a while, he pushed the door open and entered. "I'm sorry, Arthur." As he spoke, he saw the prototype of a lens fly into the air and was instantly covered by a torrential rain of phantom blade light. Fine crystal fragments continued to fall, reflecting the slightly dim light in the room. It was like a dreamy and magnificent fluorescent rain, with a kind of blurred and charming beauty. "Huh!" Tangen, who was waving his blade, sensed the door open. He subconsciously glanced at it and couldn't help but be surprised. It was just a slight fluctuation. Bang! The curved lens that was gradually being shaved into a thin piece instantly broke, and the debris fell to the ground. I'm sorry, I'm really sorry." Matthew hurriedly bowed and apologized. He knew that it was because of his sudden interference that the lens finally fell short. He couldn't help but feel regretful and sighed. Today was really unlucky. "It doesn't matter, it's just a lens." "But old Ma-you." Tangen looked up and down at Matthew's appearance. His cheeks were bruised, his hair was messy, and the neat goatee on his chin was pulled out. His whole body was covered in dirty water and dust. He couldn't help but laugh. "Were you robbed? Ha-ha, or were you chased by a dog?" Matthew gritted his teeth when he heard this. "I was bitten by a dog." It's true." Then Matthew told what happened just now. He stroked his little beard and said angrily, "Coincidence my ass. It must be that when I ordered the crystal ore yesterday, I was seen by this old dog, or someone tipped him off. That's why he was able to get ahead of us this morning." After a pause, Matthew showed an apologetic look again, But anyway, Arthur, it's all because of me this time. I'm sorry. Haha, I said it doesn't matter. In fact, the number of prototype lenses you made yesterday is enough. Tangen waved his hand and helped Matthew to sit down on the chair by the table. It's enough? Only then did Matthew see more than a dozen thin lenses on the experiment table. They were about 2 inches long and 1 inch wide. They were in an oblate shape and were arranged in groups of 2. Looking from above, the surface of the mirror was smooth and pure, without a trace of impurities, and he could vaguely see that there seemed to be some strange curvature inside. Yes. Pointing to these lenses, he said, in fact, I've already made them. I was just practicing, and I found some interesting things. Tangen did have some experience in other aspects while carving the lenses, and that was the micro-operation of the dagger. In fact, to some extent, Tangen's direct strength was still somewhat inferior to a cultivator of the same level in another world. This was because of the way they fought. Tangen could kill his opponent, but he might not be able to defeat his opponent. This statement sounded a bit contradictory, but it was true. Take Yama for example. If Tangen had not approached Yama at that time, with the crushing strength of a void stage cultivator, Tangen would have had no chance of winning. The other world's Do Chi was overbearing, while the system's Blood Chi was relatively restrained. The other world's martial artist's fighting style was open and did not require close combat to complete the battle. However, Tangen's fighting style required him to get close to his opponent and seek a one-hit kill. There was no difference between the two, but the difference in power system and fighting style made Tangen need to pull his opponent into his rhythm every time he fought. Just like the battle with Sang-Pu. At the beginning, he could only escape from Sang-Pu's powerful magic. But in the enclosed room, he could turn the tables and hit Sang-Pu hard. Because of the Blood Chi and the killer's attacking style, Tangen could no longer have a spectacular and gorgeous attack style. Since he could not start from the big picture, Tangen could only go into detail and seek the most extreme and subtle attack style. This was also an extremely wide martial arts path. And now, the engraved lenses undoubtedly gave him some inspiration. These thoughts only existed in Tangen's mind. Naturally, Matthew did not know. He looked at the neatly arranged lenses on the table and touched his sparse beard. He was a little dumbfounded. So, I fought for nothing? Sigh. He shook his head speechlessly. Well, I didn't lose anyway. That old dog was hurt worse than me. How could that be? My things are not easy to take. With a chuckle, Tangen squinted his long and narrow eyes. If Josiah, David, and other acquaintances were here and saw this inconspicuous squinting action, they would know that Tangen did not have good intentions. Sure enough, Tangen turned his head and took a drawing of a strange thing. He said casually, "Old Ma, I have to trouble you with one more thing. This is a spectacle frame. Please find some light materials and make it according to this ratio. Lan Sha is coming today. Don't let her wait too long." Spectacle frame? No problem. The structure is not complicated. Suddenly coming to his senses, half of Matthew's body was numb. He looked at the design blueprint of the frame, then looked at the transparent lens on the table, and finally looked at Twain, his lips trembling. This is made for Misty Sand Palace, His Highness? Tangen nodded. Matthew got up instantly. His bruised old face was instantly refreshed. No problem, I will get it done in an hour, no, 40 minutes. After saying that, he quickly turned around and walked to the door while waving to the apprentices standing on the side. Quick, follow me to the metal laboratory. Tangen looked at Matthew, who suddenly looked like he was injected with chicken blood. The corner of his mouth could not help but rise. He shook his head and chuckled. Of course, he knew why the other party was so happy. In fact, the reason was simple. As long as it was confirmed that this lens was made for Lan Sha, then the meaning of Clown intercepting the crystal or just now changed. It was no longer to cause trouble for Tang En and Matthew, but to cause trouble for Lan Sha. Therefore, as long as Matthew mentioned this matter to Lan Sha, there was no need to fabricate or exaggerate. He just had to tell the truth with his current appearance. By then, Clown's fate could be imagined. Tang En did not care too much about this matter. He just treated it as a small reward for Matthew's help in the past 2 days. Bending over to pick up the broken lens on the ground, Tang En frowned and gradually fell into deep thought. Since he could make a fuss about the size of the lens, then what about making it smaller or even smaller to the level of space? Perhaps because he was stimulated, Matthew's movements were very fast. In just half an hour, he grabbed 7 or 8 spectacle frames and rushed into the laboratory. Without panting, he said, "Arthur, take a look and see if these meet your requirements." "Haha, Mr. Ma, your speed is much faster than that old horse of yours." Joking, Tang En casually took a pair of spectacles from him. The shape was no different from the one designed in the drawing, but compared to the one in the modern world, this one was simpler. The turning point was fixed and could not be folded for storage. Tang En was not clear about the specific material of the frame, but it had a certain shrinkage and did not seem stiff. Matthew was in a good mood at this time and did not care about the teasing. He said cheerfully, "Haha, of course, I can't wait to see how that old dog Clown will die." Click. Because the drawing was designed according to a 1-to-1 ratio, Tang En picked up a piece of lens and pressed it, and it fit perfectly with the frame. He nodded, "No problem. Haha, it's done." With a clap of his hands, Matthew was overjoyed. When he saw Tang En put on the second lens, he could not help but ask in confusion, "By the way, Arthur, I forgot to ask you, what is the use of this thing for His Highness Lan Sha?" Tang En tried to put on the glasses, blinked, and took it off again. "Remember what I said before? I want to develop 2 things, one to be able to see close and the other to be able to see far away." He raised the glasses in his hand. "This thing is called glasses. It can let myopic people, well, it can let Lan Sha see close." Matthew had been in the northern wilderness Imperial City for more than 10 years, so he naturally knew the problem with Lan Sha's eyes. He also knew that this was the only flaw of Lan Sha, known as the Pearl of the Northern Wilderness. He was surprised and happy when he heard this thing. "This pair of glasses can let His Highness Lan Sha see clearly?" Arthur, it's not that I don't believe you, it's just that. Too incredible? Haha. Seeing Matthew anxiously organizing his words, Tang En chuckled and continued, "Don't worry, Elder Ma. Now we just have to wait for Lan Sha to come." After a pause, Tang En raised his eyebrows slightly and turned to look at the door of the laboratory. There was a burst of messy footsteps in the corridor outside the door. There seemed to be a lot of people. "Haha, so soon? It seems that you have a lot of resentment for your poor eyesight." Immediately, a majestic figure appeared at the door first. It was André in armor. First, he quickly scanned the room with his sword. Seeing that there was no danger, he grinned at Tang En and stepped aside without saying anything. In an instant, the dim room seemed to be lit up. Lan Sha, who was wearing a cotton skirt with a tight waist and a pure white fur cloak, walked in. Her footsteps were light, and her eyes were calm as she looked around. She was like an elegant deer walking out of a snowy world. "Pretend. Keep pretending." Looking at Lan Sha, who was dressed as if she was otherworldly, Tang En secretly curled his lip. He knew best what kind of decisive and ruthless methods this girl, who looked like an elegant deer, had. Of course, even though that was what he thought, Tang En's gaze still swept imperceptibly over her slender waist, and he smacked his lips lightly. "TSK, I haven't seen her for a few days. Why do I feel that this girl's figure is getting better and better? Humph." With a cold snort, Tang En still underestimated the sensitivity of women to glances at their bodies. Before he could retract his gaze, Lan Sha's cold eyes caught his. His gaze suddenly froze and became as sharp as a knife. Ahem. After coughing twice, even someone as calm as Tang En couldn't help but feel embarrassed. He avoided the cold gaze and bowed slightly. Greetings, Your Highness Lan Sha. On the side, Matthew also bowed and greeted, but he couldn't be as casual as Tang En. He placed his right hand on his left chest and bowed almost 90 degrees, giving a northern wilderness greeting. Lan Sha looked at Tang En and narrowed his eyes. He didn't know what he was thinking. Then, he calmly turned his gaze and said, "No need to be so polite." With that, he stepped straight into the laboratory. Tang En also saw that there were some people following behind Lan Sha. Among them, he only recognized Sidney, Andre, and the director of the Craftsman Institute. He didn't know about the other young or middle-aged northern wilderness people. If he didn't guess wrongly, they should be those deputy chiefs who were mostly gilded. Her cold gaze swept over the glasses in Tang En's hand, and she said directly, "These are, glasses for me?" Lan Sha had heard Tang En describe the glasses before, and now she recognized them at a glance. "That's right." Tang En shrugged and handed the glasses over. "I just made them. Do you want to try them?" "Okay." Pursing his lips, Lan Sha had a rare look of excitement on his face. He was about to reach out and take the glasses when suddenly, a hurried shout sounded. "Wait!" Chapter 668. Wait! I'm here to deliver something, let me in. Tang En turned his head in surprise, only to see Claude at the door. He had panda eyes, and his face was green and black. He looked anxious and wanted to rush into the room, but he was held back by the royal guards. "Claude? What are you doing here?" The director's face darkened, and he reprimanded in a low voice. Matthew's face also darkened. You still dare to come here?" Tang En's eyes flashed as he looked at Claude's anxious expression that couldn't hide his fear. He muttered to himself for a moment, and suddenly understood. Obviously, there was something wrong with the few apprentices here, and they must have passed on the conversation between him and Matthew to Claude. As such, Claude, who knew that he was in big trouble, naturally came to try to save himself. The royal guards saw that the person inside did indeed know Claude, and Lan Sha frowned and waved his hand, so they let Claude go and let him enter the room. Claude limped to the center of the room and bowed to Lan Sha in the northern wilderness. "Your Highness, I'm here to deliver the crystal ores. I didn't know that Sir Matthew's experiment was to develop something for Your Highness, and I accidentally took the crystal ores this morning, and there was a small misunderstanding with Sir Matthew. In short, it's all my fault. Here, I would like to sincerely apologize to Sir Matthew." He turned around and bowed 90 degrees, looking at the startled Matthew with a pleading expression, looking extremely pitiful. Why else would they say that life is like a play and it all depends on acting skills? Tang En couldn't help but laugh when he saw this, and he couldn't help but sigh with emotion. Claude had lived for most of his life, and his face, dignity, and so on were completely fleeting. Look at his sincere expression, look at his pitiful little eyes. He was completely at the level of an Oscar. It was just a pity that Matthew had a feud with him for more than 10 years, and even completely shed all pretense of cordiality just now. How could he not know Claude's nature, and how could Claude put himself in danger for the sake of some compatriots? Coming back to his senses, he immediately flew into a rage. "You're playing." Looking at Lan Sha, Matthew took back his words and said angrily, "Clorin, stop pretending. Where's the arrogance you had when you were clamoring to kill me?" He turned around and bowed to Lan Sha. "Your Highness, please don't listen to this villain's one-sided story. This morning, he clearly snatched that batch of crystal ores on purpose to obstruct Sir Arthur's progress in developing glasses for you." "Oh, is that so?" Lan Sha responded noncommittally. He glanced at the two of them and then glanced at Tang En. The latter, on the other hand, stood quietly by the side with his glasses in hand, looking as if it had nothing to do with him. It wasn't that Tang En didn't want to help Matthew, but he knew that Lan Sha had an almost monstrous IQ. As long as she looked at him for a while, she would naturally be able to tell who was real and who was fake. And if he interfered rashly, it wouldn't be good. Because now Tang En couldn't figure out what he was like in Lan Sha's heart. "Your Highness, he's lying." Seeing that the tender card didn't work, Clorin's eyes suddenly flashed with a trace of fierceness. After a flash, he sighed helplessly to Matthew. "Sai, you and I have worked together for so many years. Although there are usually some small conflicts, I have always regarded you as a friend. I didn't expect you to resent me so much." He shook his head in disappointment, then turned to Lan Sha and said, "Your Highness, in fact, this is just a misunderstanding. I didn't expect it to end up like this. I also didn't expect that Sir Matthew, His fingers trembled and he choked. "He just grabbed such a small problem and wanted to kill me." "What? I want to kill you?" Matthew's face was full of absurdity when he heard this, and he almost went berserk. Acting and interpersonal communication were not his strong point. If he was in the modern world, he would be the kind of diligent and serious researcher. Otherwise, he wouldn't be a low-level alchemist who didn't even have his own laboratory. Tang En couldn't help but shake his head when he saw this. He sighed that this combat power was too weak and couldn't be counted on at all. He looked up at Lan Sha and handed over the glasses again. "Let's put this aside for now, Your Highness Lan Sha. It's more important to try on the glasses." Before Lan Sha nodded and stretched out his hand, Clorin, who looked innocent and regretful, jumped out again and gave Tang En a subtle stare. "Wait a minute." Clorin didn't dare to let Lan Sha wear the glasses, because once the experiment was successful, Tang En and Matthew would be the great contributors to solving the eye disease that had troubled His Highness Lan Sha for more than 20 years. When that time came, Matthew would only need to take credit and mention this matter again. Wouldn't Clorin be in trouble? Tang En, of course, knew what Clorin was thinking, and he also praised the other party's reaction speed. The corner of his mouth rose, and he said with a smile, "Oh? I wonder if Sir Clorin has anything else to say?" "You old man, what's your intention for repeatedly stopping His Highness from wearing glasses?" This was Andre's support. "I'm thinking for the safety of His Highness." At this time, Clorin also threw caution to the wind. He braced himself and said anxiously, "Your Highness, this Arthur has only been in the craftsman's office for a day or two. He doesn't know anything about alchemy. Now that he suddenly took out this gadget that no one has ever seen before, who knows if it's dangerous for you?" "That's right. Alchemy items are really hard to say. Also, who has heard of something that can be seen clearly by someone with a natural eye disease? No. And this Arthur? Why haven't I heard of this person in the craftsman's office? Could it be that he's only been here for a day or two? Isn't that just nonsense?" It had to be said that these words sounded very reasonable, and the surrounding people couldn't help but agree. Andre, who was about to throw Clorin out, couldn't help but hesitate. It wasn't that he doubted Tang En, but that protecting Lan Sha was indeed his duty. Therefore, he naturally didn't dare to be careless. Tang En's expression didn't change. He nodded and said, "Well, it makes sense. What do you mean?" "Check." Clorin narrowed his eyes and said without hesitation, "For this kind of unknown thing, we must conduct a detailed inspection from all aspects in order to avoid possible dangers. As long as we get through today, I don't care if this thing is dangerous or not." "That's right." Tang En once again nodded thoughtlessly and handed the glasses over. "But a detailed inspection is too slow. Since Sir Clorin is skeptical, why don't you try it on yourself?" "Arthur, no." Matthew was shocked. What good could the glasses be in Clorin's hands? Nitpicking was a light matter. Even if there was no problem, he could still find a problem. He immediately wanted to dissuade Clorin, but he was stopped by Tang En's eyes after spitting out a few words. Clorin was overjoyed. "Haha, good. Let this old man try it on for his highness. He didn't forget to secretly show off and then took the glasses. He, don't be in a hurry to try it on. Tang En said with a smile, you don't believe in the effect of the glasses, but Elder Ma does. Why don't we make a small bet? Of course, since it's a bet, there must be a prize. Well, if the final result is that you lose, then give the position of the area's person in charge to Elder Ma. What do you think? This was Tang En's style of doing things, harming others for his own benefit. Previously, he let Clorin successfully intercept the item and didn't attack because he was digging a hole to harm others. Now, he took this opportunity to get a good position for Matthew, who was on good terms with him. That was for his own benefit. Of course, Tang En glanced at Matthew, who was stunned by the bet and looked indifferent. The opportunity had been given. Whether you can grasp it or not depends on yourself. Clorin was furious when he heard that Tang En wanted to rob him of the promotion opportunity that he had obtained through flattery. His eyes were fierce, but he immediately reacted. Yes, once the matter of me causing trouble for His Highness Lan Sha is exposed, I can forget about this position. Since I'm going to be unlucky anyway, I might as well take a gamble. However, although he had made up his mind, the old and cunning Clorin didn't immediately agree. Instead, he suddenly put on the glasses cunningly. He wanted to see the effect first to be in an invincible position. Tang En smiled gently and didn't stop him. The people on the side were a little nervous. Their bodies were stiff as they stared at Clorin's expression and movements. Lan Sha also narrowed her eyes and watched, her slender fingers unconsciously intertwined together. In fact, from the beginning, she didn't care about the so-called dispute between Matthew and Clorin. The reason why she waited patiently until now was to see if Tang En, who always did something unexpected, could give her a surprise this time and solve the problem that had troubled her for more than 20 years. Clorin, who was wearing glasses, blinked and seemed to be a little surprised. Then, he looked at the experimental table on the left and Lan Sha and the others on the right. He hesitated, raised his hand in front of his eyes, and waved. Andre couldn't help but frown and scold. F***ck, are you done yet? How is the effect? Say something. Just as he said a word, Clorin's body suddenly staggered. He quickly took off his glasses and seemed to be a little dizzy. Then, he took a deep breath. Nothing could be seen from his wrinkled old face. It seems that I'm a little old. I just stood for a while, and I feel a little uncomfortable. After a pause, he looked at Tang En and said, well, since you want that position so much, I'll accompany you to the end. But according to the rules of the bet, if I'm lucky enough to win, then Sir Matthew has to leave the workshop. This condition isn't too much, right? Haha, only a fool wouldn't bet. What stupid glasses, I was worried about it before. There's no need to find fault with them at all. After wearing them, my vision will be blurry and it will cause dizziness. I'll see how you die later. Twain pursed his lips when he heard that. He was too lazy to pay attention to Claude, who was still putting on an act. He turned his gaze to Matthew. Idiot, if you're not nearsighted, do you think you can see clearly with your glasses on? I'll bet. Although he felt something was wrong from the secret of Clorin, Matthew finally chose to believe in Tang En. He hammered his palm and agreed loudly. Haha, good. Refreshing. Claude, who had been staring at Twain because he was worried about exposing his joy, suddenly raised his head and laughed. He turned his head and looked at Matthew with the attitude of a winner. He did not mention the danger and directly handed the glasses to Lan Sha. Your Highness, in order to expose this ridiculous farce and to prove my innocence, please wear them and let someone give up. Lan Sha took the glasses but did not immediately put them on. Instead, he frowned and looked at Tang En with some inquiry in his eyes. Then he waved his hand and said coldly, You all get out. It's okay. This chick still has some conscience. Tang En certainly knew the intention of Lan Sha's move. It was nothing more than giving him a way out. He waved his hand and said, "Just wear them here, and let someone give up." Similar words immediately made Matthew's old face turn black. He glared fiercely at Tang En. "Pretend, keep pretending. You'll cry later." Lan Sha chuckled and no longer hesitated. He raised his hand and put on the glasses. The two brackets went through his hair and fixed on his small and exquisite ears. When he looked up, his clear eyes suddenly froze and his delicate body trembled slightly. In an instant the room was silent and snow was slowly falling outside the window. "Ha ha, it's coming, it's coming." Clorin's mouth gradually cracked open, and the wrinkles on his old face piled up like a chrysanthemum. Matthew's body tensed up, his lips trembled, and his right hand subconsciously made a prayer gesture in front of his chest. Well, everyone's attention was now on Lan Sha. Otherwise, with this prayer gesture of the Temple of Light, he would be finished. Tang En's expression was still as usual. He looked into Lan Sha's eyes and broke the silence. "This is a 500-degree lens. If it's still a little blurry, you can change it to a clearer one." "No need." Shaking his head slightly, Lan Sha stared at Tang En's face. It seemed like it was the first time she knew him, but it also seemed like a flower was about to bloom. She lightly opened her red lips and said, "I feel very good now." Tang En's cheeks twitched under this seemingly sharper gaze. He looked away and spread his hands, then, "Congratulations." "Thank you." Lan Sha's eyes drooped slightly. Then, under the incredulous gaze of the surrounding people, she bowed to Tang En in a royal etiquette. Her long skirt spread out like an ink lotus. Getting up, Lan Sha turned to look at the stunned Matthew and said indifferently, "Now, you're the person in charge of the craftsman's area." I don't accept this." Before the stuttering Matthew could say a complete sentence, Claude, who finally reacted, shouted with a face full of unwillingness, "Those glasses obviously can't see anything, and I'll feel dizzy when I wear them. How can they win?" Lan Sha coldly glanced at him. "No, I saw it very clearly, including your disgusting face." "No, it's not like this." Claude roared hoarsely, his face full of despair. You're lying, right? Tell me, what benefits did they give you?" "I understand now, you all colluded together to lie to me." The roaring suddenly stopped. Andre's face was livid. He grabbed Claude's neck and raised him up like he was pinching a chicken. F***ck, how dare you slander His Highness? I think you old dog are tired of living. He turned around and walked out of the door. "Let's go, we need to find a place to have a good chat." You're tuning in to the Phoenix Nights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.